bizarre superstitions that controlled empires to fall asleep. To beneath the eternal glow of a waning moon, Rome slept uneasily, its streets slick with the damp breath of night. The Tiber murmured against ancient stone, carrying whispers of lives long vanished and shadows of empires yet to crumble. Within the heart of the city, where marble pillars rose like frozen prayers to the gods, a different kind of power stirred, not forged from sword or coin, but from the fragile tremor of belief. In the flickering torchlight of the augur's chambers, the air thickened with incense and the low hum of anticipation. For Rome's destiny often hinged upon the flight of birds and the entrails of beasts. A whisper, so small, could bend the wills of emperors and steer legions toward triumph or ruin. It was the year to 49 CE. An emperor decides walked beneath the grand arches with a measured tread that barely disturbed the echoing marble halls. His mind, however, was restless. Rome was a city of grandeur and terror, of sprawling forums and silent conspiracies, and even emperors could not command certainty. The haruspices had been summoned, the priests trained in the sacred art of reading the entrails of sacrificed animals, interpreters of signs that belonged to the gods. A bull, white as the winter moon, had been led to the altar, its still eyes reflecting a knowledge no mortal could claim. The priests murmured incantations, tracing charred patterns in the firelight, their fingers trembling as they lifted the liver, examining its contours, its blemishes, its every imperfection. A collective silence fell, as if the very walls of Rome held its breath. The liver bore a mark dark and uneven, a blemish that no one dared define aloud. It was a sign, a portent, a whisper from the divine that could unravel the threads of empire. The city quaked in anticipation. Couriers galloped through shadowed streets, bearing news to the Senate, to the generals, to the governors of distant provinces. Panic was contagious. Fear spread faster than any plague. Campaigns that had been planned with precision were abandoned. Armies redirected by the trembling hands of men who interpreted the unknown as doom. Decisions that shaped battles, treaties, and the lives of thousands were made not from wisdom or foresight, but from a fragile interpretation of flesh and fire. Outside the temples, the cries of sacred birds punctuated the darkness. Geese honked in restless flights, their wings slicing the night air like sharpened knives. Ravens cawed, feathers gleaming under torchlight, their black eyes reflecting a world the living could not fathom. Rome itself seemed to listen, leaning into the tension, as if aware that its destiny rested not upon generals' cunning, but on the subtle inclinations of omen and superstition. Every gesture, every word spoken in hushed reverence, held the weight of life and death. It was a city governed by shadows, where whispers could summon triumph and curses alike. The historians who would come after would puzzle over the events of that year. Scrolls that might have explained the true meaning of the blemished liver were lost to fire and decay. Scholars could only speculate. Had the size acted wisely, following divine guidance, or had fear and ritual supplanted reason? Some suggested that superstition merely mirrored the anxieties of men, who understood the fragility of their power, magnifying doubt into decisive action. Yet for those who lived through it, for those who hurried through rain-slicked streets and trembled before augurs' pronouncements, the line between reality and omen was indistinguishable. Rome itself, eternal and capricious, seemed to pulse with the hidden rhythms of fate, acknowledging that human ambition was always subordinate to the whispers of unseen forces. As days passed, the consequences of that single reading unfolded. Military campaigns were executed with caution, some abandoned entirely, while rebellions in the provinces were crushed or left to fester. Based on interpretations of the sacred signs, emissaries carried messages punctuated with the language of fear and devotion, their words threaded with trembling uncertainty. The Senate debated in candlelit chambers, aware that an emperor's judgment could be both divine and fragile, and in every corner of the city, from the silent cloisters of temples to the bustling forums, Rome moved to the rhythm of invisible hands. The gods, it seemed, preferred to speak in shadows and tremors, leaving their will discernible only to those trained to see beyond the veil. Even now, centuries later, the story lingers like a ghost in the stones of the city. The Tiber continues its eternal murmur, the arches of temples rise against the sky, and yet the precise whisper that shaped an emperor's hand remains lost to time. The truth of that blemished liver is unknowable, a riddle that bridges history and myth. Perhaps Rome was shaped by superstition, or perhaps superstition merely echoed the fears that all men carry when confronted with the enormity of their own mortality. The distinction is subtle as a bird's shadow across marble, and it matters little to the soul who contemplates it in the quiet of night. In the stillness of memory, One can imagine the flicker of torchlight in the augur's chamber, the whispered incantations, the collective breath held by a city that both feared and revered the unknown. There is a sacredness in that fear, a reverence for the invisible, a recognition that even the greatest empire was ultimately guided not by steel or law, but by subtle, fragile signs that spoke in riddles and shadows. Rome endures, not merely as a testament to conquest and law, but as a monument to human devotion to mysteries that may never be solved, to whispers that may have shaped the course of history, and to the quiet power of belief that can govern even the mightiest of men. And in that whisper, lingering in the folds of memory and stone, Rome continues to speak, urging us to listen to what is unseen, to honor the delicate tremors of fate, and to remember that even empires, like men, are fragile before the subtle dictates of the divine. Beneath the echo of ancient arches, where shadows pooled like spilled ink across marble floors, the city of Rome stirred again, as if reluctant to let go of the omens that had haunted it for generations. The torchlight danced along the walls, casting fractured shapes that seemed almost alive, mimicking the anxious movement of senators pacing in corridors, of generals whispering in darkened halls. Even in quiet moments, when the clatter of feet and the murmur of voices faded, a palpable tension lingered. Rome's heartbeat synchronized to signs invisible, read only by those attuned to the whispers of gods and the silent language of nature. Emperor Decius, cloaked in ceremonial robes of deep crimson and gold, walked with measured steps to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. The air was thick with incense and the faint metallic tang of blood from sacrifices past. Around him, priests murmured prayers with mouths barely moving, their hands brushing over sacred bones and charred symbols as though to coax secrets from the very fabric of the world. They spoke in cryptic phrases, each word weighted, as if the sound itself might summon disaster or salvation. Every eye in the chamber was fixed on the liver of the bull, still glistening in the dim light, every imperfection magnified under their careful scrutiny. Outside, the city felt a tension that was almost alive. Markets were quieter than usual, the chatter of merchants stilled by an instinctive fear. Children huddled close to mothers' skirts, sensing the shift in the air that they could not name. Soldiers paused in their training, listening to distant echoes, as if the entire world had been slowed by the weight of prophecy. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the foundations of empire were balanced on a single, trembling hand. The omens had become a mirror of the collective anxiety, reflecting not just the will of the gods, but the fragile human fear of power, mortality, and the unknown. As days bled into nights, each decision of the emperor and his council seemed guided by invisible strings. Letters were drafted and redrafted, armies positioned and repositioned, treaties delayed, and alliances reconsidered, all at the suggestion of a liver marked by unseen hands. Couriers sped through streets slick with rain, their shadows stretching unnaturally in torchlight, carrying words that might mean life or death. And yet, amidst all the maneuvering, the true meaning of the omen remained hidden, lost to time and fire, leaving behind only a haunting sense of mystery and reverence. In quiet moments, alone in the palace, Decius would gaze out over the city from his high balcony, the torchlight of distant temples flickering like tiny constellations in the night. The wind carried whispers from the Tiber, the murmur of water against stone, the faint cries of birds who had long been messengers of the gods. The city below seemed suspended in a fragile balance between fear and faith, between the visible and the unseen. Each shadow, each whisper of movement, was a potential sign, a potential warning, and Rome itself became a living testament to the power of belief, the silent hand that could direct armies, halt campaigns, and bend even the mightiest rulers to its will. Historians would later try to parse the events, to understand whether superstition shaped the empire or merely reflected the insecurities of men who wielded unimaginable power. Yet perhaps the distinction does not matter. Perhaps what endures is the image of a city trembling beneath invisible hands, of a ruler navigating the delicate threads of fate, and of a civilization bound not just by law and conquest, but by the sacred, fragile whispers of the divine. Rome, eternal and enigmatic, whispers still in stone and shadow, reminding us that even the greatest of empires can be guided by the faintest of signs, and that sometimes the most profound truths are those that cannot be spoken, only felt. The city sleeps now, but in the hush of midnight, one can almost hear the echo of those ancient augurs, the soft rustle of feathers, the murmur of prayers, and the quiet, enduring whisper that once shaped the destiny of Rome itself. The first light of dawn crept over the rolling hills of the Yellow River, casting long shadows across the earth where the Han dynasty held sway. Mist clung to the valleys like a reluctant spirit, curling around the roots of ancient trees and the weathered stones of temples long abandoned. In the heart of this empire, where emperors ruled with absolute authority and armies moved like living rivers across the plains, another kind of power commanded the attention of kings, a power unseen, intangible, yet unyielding. It was the power of divination, the secret language of the gods etched into bone and shell, whispered through cracks that only the faithful could read. Deep within the imperial palace, a chamber burned with the soft glow of oil lamps. The air was thick with incense, a heady mixture of sandalwood and resin, suffocating to the uninitiated but comforting to those who had long listened to the will of ancestors. Here, the court diviners, clothed in robes of deep indigo and gold, crouched over ox shoulder bones and turtle shells. Each piece had been carefully chosen, cleaned, and marked with questions posed by the emperor himself. Will the harvest fail? Should armies advance on distant provinces? Will rivals rise to challenge my rule? Each crack, each charred fracture, was a line in a story only the sacred could read. The emperor watched silently, his eyes shadowed by both awe and fear. To Kangxi or Han Wudi, or the unknown rulers whose names might be lost to time, the dragon bones were not mere instruments. They were conduits to the divine, a direct line to ancestors who shaped destiny from beyond the veil. Flames licked the shells, tiny pops echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. The bones twisted and groaned, splitting along ancient lines, and the diviners whispered interpretations in tones that barely disturbed the stillness. The words were cryptic, laden with metaphor. The serpent lies between the river and the mountains. The harvest is bound in shadow. The enemy will see the sun set twice before the river flows red. To the untrained ear, they were nonsense. To the emperor, they were law, a roadmap of fate that could not be ignored. Outside, the palace was alive with tension. Servants moved silently through corridors, carrying bowls of food and water for those waiting in anxious anticipation. Soldiers paused in barracks, straining to hear distant incantations, believing that even the faintest crack in the bone could dictate their fortunes. Governors in distant provinces adjusted plans, delaying campaigns or redirecting reinforcements, all because an unseen hand had signaled caution or disaster. Entire strategies of war and governance were bent, folded, and rewritten in obedience to fragile fractures in turtle shells, each line a potential death sentence or deliverance. Sometimes, the cracks foretold catastrophe. A subtle fissure in the liver-shaped section of a shell could indicate treachery in the court. A sharp, jagged split might mean drought or rebellion. Emperors trusted these signs above all else, acting with the reverence due only to the sacred. Historians centuries later speculate how many battles were won or lost because of these readings. How many lives were sacrificed not to the enemy, but to the invisible patterns dictated by flames and bone. And yet, for those living it, the distinction between superstition and strategy was irrelevant. To ignore the omens was to invite ruin, to court disaster not with swords, but with arrogance. Even within the palace, doubt crept like a shadow along the walls. Some ministers whispered quietly, fearful of offending both emperor and divine will, wondering if the fractures were truly messages from the ancestors or merely accidents of fire and bone. Still, the emperor could not afford skepticism. Decisions rested on these interpretations. Armies were deployed, crops stored, treaties signed or broken, all under the quiet dictation of dragon bones that had lain in the earth for centuries, their power renewed by human belief and fear. At night, when the candles burned low and the palace halls grew silent, the emperor would walk alone along the corridors, the echo of his sandals a somber reminder of mortality. The bones had spoken. The decisions were made. Yet an unshakable tension remained. What if the cracks were wrong? What if the ancestors had been misheard? What if human error, rather than divine intent, had twisted the meaning of the signs? And yet, even this doubt was shaped by the weight of belief. For to doubt was to challenge the sacred order itself. The emperor, alone with shadows that clung like loyal specters, could only bow before the invisible hand that guided the empire. In the quiet hours before dawn, the yellow river flowed like liquid silver, reflecting the first rays of the sun and the flickering lights of distant watchtowers. Somewhere, a bird cried, its voice carrying across the fog-laden hills. The empire slept, but it was not at peace. Even the stones of the palace seemed to remember the decisions dictated by bone and flame, the lives altered by the tremors of superstition. The dragon bones had left their mark on history, shaping not only events, but the very consciousness of those who wielded power. a reminder that human ambition, for all its reach, bends easily before signs unseen. Perhaps it is the greatest paradox of empire that the mightiest armies and the most intricate laws, the greatest scholars and architects, all owe allegiance to forces invisible and often incomprehensible. The dragon bones are silent now, stored in museums or lost to time, yet their echo lingers. Every fracture tells a story, every fissure whispers of fear, devotion, and the fragile boundary between knowledge and faith. And as the wind moves across the hills, rustling bamboo and stone alike, it carries the quiet, eternal reminder that the course of history is often shaped not by hands or hearts, but by shadows of belief, bending the fates of men and empires alike, one sacred crack at a time, beneath the endless expanse of the steppe, where the wind moved like a restless spirit and the grass whispered secrets to the sky. The Mongol Empire stretched as far as the eye could see. The horizon seemed endless, a rolling sea of green and gold, dotted only by the silhouettes of horses and the flicker of distant fires. Here, where the earth itself seemed alive with hidden power, the line between the natural and the supernatural was thin. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and horseflesh, of cold dew and iron, and it carried a weight that pressed even on those who thought themselves fearless. For Genghis Khan, the great Khan, strength alone could not secure victory. The invisible currents of fate were a force to be reckoned with, and they were read by the shamans, those who spoke with spirits, commanded omens, and interpreted the tremors of the earth as messages from the unseen. In a yurt on the edge of a rolling hill, a shaman crouched over a small fire, the smoke rising in twisting spirals as if reaching for the sky itself. Her voice, low and melodic, hummed in the rhythm of ancient chants, vibrating against the canvas and bone of the tent. She traced patterns in the sand, marking symbols of ancestors long past, spirits who had guided the steppe for centuries before the rise of empires. Horses pawed the frozen ground outside, their breath steaming in the dawn air. Yet even they seemed to sense the gravity of the ritual unfolding. Warriors had gathered quietly, their faces tense and pale beneath furs, eyes fixed on the smoke, their hands gripping the reins of fate more tightly than the bridles of their mounts. The shamans spoke of rivers that would rise red with blood, of skies where birds fell silent before disaster, of omens that could determine the life or death of generals, the success or failure of armies, and the very survival of Khan's dominion. She predicted which cities to strike, which roads to avoid, which allies might betray, and which enemies were already weakened by the hands of spirits unseen. The Khan listened in near silence, his eyes shadowed by firelight, his mind weighing each word with the reverence of one who understood that human courage alone was not enough. For Genghis Khan, defying these signs was unthinkable. Every decision, every movement of troops was entwined with the invisible dance of omens. Outside the yurt, the steppe seemed to hold its breath. Wolves howled in the distance, carrying their cries across miles of empty land, echoing as if the spirits themselves were warning of coming peril. A river glimmered in the first light of dawn, and for a moment, its surface seemed to ripple unnaturally, reflecting images no mortal could fully interpret. Horses shivered and stamped, generals exchanged glances, and the soldiers of the empire moved with deliberate caution, guided not by strategy alone, but by the subtle currents of fate as interpreted by the shaman's chant and the silent will of ancestors. In the nights that followed, as the armies marched across frozen plains and arid hills, strange events seemed to follow them. Birds fell from the sky, clouds moved in unnatural patterns, and rivers appeared to twist like serpents under the moonlight. Some called it coincidence, some called it magic. Yet for the Khan and his people, it was the natural order of the universe speaking in a language older than words, a language understood only by those willing to see beyond the veil. Decisions that would shape the course of empires, the fall of cities, the rise of generals, the deaths of kings were guided as much by these invisible forces as by the steel of swords, or the discipline of troops. Even the Khan, who had conquered more land than any man before him, walked with reverence before the unknown. At night, he would sit atop his horse on a wind-swept ridge, watching the fires of distant camps flicker against the darkness. The shaman's words echoed in his mind. The enemy may fall, or the gods may decree defeat. The river may rise, or the wind may betray the march. He had learned that the steppe, vast and eternal, obeyed a will beyond any mortal hand, and that the mightiest empires were fragile before omens whispered in smoke and shadow. The Mongol shaman's influence did not end with the campaigns. Her visions, preserved in fragmented chronicles, would ripple through history like a hidden current. Cities burned or survived, alliances held or crumbled, and generals lived or died according to the signs she discerned. Whether these events were guided by fate, coincidence, or the shaman's uncanny insight, they shaped the trajectory of the world, bending history to the rhythm of belief. The steppe itself seemed to remember, and even centuries later, one can imagine the wind carrying the echoes of chants, the whisper of hoofbeats, and the silent, unyielding power of superstition that commanded empires. In reflection, it becomes clear that human ambition, even when clad in armor and mounted on the fastest horse, is subordinate to forces unseen. The shaman spoke in shadows, in smoke, in the tremors of the earth and the cry of birds. She interpreted signs that others could not perceive, guiding the hands of a man who would be feared and revered for millennia. The empire, vast and unstoppable in its conquests, moved as if possessed by a silent, invisible hand. It was a testament to the delicate, terrifying power of superstition, the notion that victory, defeat, life, and death could be dictated not by mortal courage alone, but by whispers of spirits, by subtle signs, and by the ancient wisdom of those attuned to the hidden world. Even today, the steppe stretches endlessly under the sun and moon, its grass swaying in a rhythm unchanged by time. The echoes of chants, the stories of visions, and the whispers of omens linger in the wind. The Mongol Empire, though fallen, bears witness to the truth that men and nations often bow to what cannot be seen. That history is shaped not only by the tangible hand of power, but by the fragile, sacred currents of belief. And somewhere, in the silence between hoofbeats and wind, the whisper of a shaman can still be heard, guiding the fate of all who dare to listen. The city of Constantinople slept uneasily beneath a sky heavy with portent. The air was thick with the mingling scents of sea brine, incense from countless churches, and the faint copper tang of blood that history seemed to leave lingering in its shadowed streets. The domes of Hagia Sophia glimmered faintly under the pale light of an unnatural moon, crimson and foreboding, hanging low like a warning painted across the heavens. For the citizens below, it was a night like no other night when the gods, or some darker force, seemed to watch with sharp and unblinking eyes. The year was the 10th century, and the Byzantine Empire, proud and ancient, stretched across continents and seas, a jewel in the crown of Christendom, yet ever vulnerable to intrigue and plague. Within the palace walls, courtiers moved cautiously, their long robes whispering against polished stone floors, their eyes darting to the red-tinted sky. Emperors, who held armies and laws as instruments of their will, trembled before signs such as these. Blood moons were not mere celestial phenomena to them. They were declarations from the heavens, proclamations that warned of betrayal, death, and chaos yet to come. Emperor Romanos II, young and already marked by the weight of inherited power, gazed from the upper balcony of the great palace. His eyes reflected the eerie red glow, a light that painted the columns and battlements in tones of sorrow and forewarning. Priests, astrologers, and courtiers knelt or whispered at his side, interpreting every hue, every shadow, every subtle shift in the night. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the very pattern of life might shift beneath a sky painted in blood. The blood of the heavens, murmured one astrologer, his voice trembling, foretells the fall of houses, the death of heirs, and the overturning of fortunes. In the days that followed, the empire moved in cautious, almost ritualistic motions. Orders were delayed. Troops lingered in barracks instead of marching. Envoys were recalled and dispatched anew. A shadow of fear passed through the palace like a silent wind, unsettling even the most seasoned generals. Suddenly, couriers would report deaths of nobles in distant provinces, some by illness, others by mysterious circumstances. Rebellions, real or imagined, were suppressed before they could begin. The blood moon, though fleeting in the sky, left a lasting mark, bending decisions, guiding actions, and threading superstition into the fabric of governance. Citizens, sensing the unease, whispered in markets and along the narrow, stone-paved streets. Mothers hushed children who pointed at the crimson moon, fearful that even their innocence might anger the gods. Merchants hesitated to make deals, worried that misfortune would follow the reckless. Even the tide seemed slower, as if the waters themselves knew the city had been touched by something beyond understanding. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and every crack of a stone or creak of a door became a potential omen, evidence that the empire itself was listening to the warning of the sky. And yet, for all the fear, there was a strange beauty in the phenomenon, a reminder of the delicate dance between the mortal and the divine. Romanos to move through his chambers, consulting maps and scrolls, making plans and canceling others, every decision infused with reverence for a power that could not be questioned. The blood moon was not merely a celestial event. It was a mirror of human fragility, a reminder that even emperors, armed with armies and fortified cities, were subordinate to signs that existed beyond comprehension. As night deepened, the red moon waned, leaving only faint traces in the sky. Still, the effects lingered. Political alliances shifted subtly, marriages were reconsidered, and envoys spoke in hushed tones of what had been foretold. For the empire, the consequences were tangible. Lives had been changed, campaigns delayed or altered, and even the course of law bent under the weight of superstition. What might have been ordinary days were transformed into a sacred theater of caution, obedience, and fear. In the quiet hours before dawn, the domes of Constantinople gleamed with dew and the first touch of sunlight. The streets, once tense with expectation, returned to their rhythm. Yet the memory of the blood moon persisted, etched into the minds of those who had watched and feared. Historians would later record the event, but even centuries removed, the meaning of that crimson sky remained partially veiled, a blend of natural phenomenon and the supernatural interpretation that governed men's lives. Perhaps it is in this blending that the true power of superstition is revealed, not in the event itself, but in the response it evokes. The trembling of rulers, the caution of armies, the fear of ordinary people, and the subtle, enduring influence on the course of history. Constantinople, city of domes and shadows, stood as a testament to the idea that even mighty empires could be guided by signs that were fleeting, mysterious, and eternal. And so, beneath the fading traces of the blood moon, one can almost imagine the city holding its breath, listening to whispers of the divine, remembering that the sky itself could command obedience, influence destiny, and remind all who walked its streets that human power, however vast, was always fragile before the unseen, the sacred, and the eternal patterns of the universe. The wind swept across the endless Mongolian steppe like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of earth and horseflesh, of snow and fire, of a world untouched by stone or empire. In the distance, the horizon shimmered, broken only by the silhouettes of mounted warriors whose shadows stretched long and thin against the golden grass. Here, where the sky seemed impossibly vast and earth breathed beneath your feet, a single whisper could change the fate of nations, and the faintest tremor in the air could foretell victory or annihilation. The Mongols had learned this truth long before their empire reached across continents, that the seen world, no matter how vast or brutal, was only half of existence. The unseen, the sacred currents of fate interpreted by shamans, held the real power. Within a yurt, the fire's glow flickered against walls of felt and wood. Smoke curled upward, carrying the pungent scent of herbs burned to summon the spirits of ancestors. The shaman, a woman of quiet authority, crouched over the embers, tracing sigils in the sand, whispering words older than the mountains themselves. Her voice rose and fell in a haunting cadence, calling the spirits whose presence could not be questioned, whose will could not be defied. Outside, horses pawed at the frozen earth, sensing the tension, while warriors waited silently, their eyes trained on the patterns of smoke, on the ritual that could decide whether they would march into glory or disaster. Genghis Khan, the great Khan, stood near the entrance, silent and motionless, his expression a mask of contemplation. To him, the shaman's words were law as binding as any decree, as inevitable as the movement of the stars. She spoke of rivers rising red with blood, of enemies' hearts faltering, of betrayal within his own ranks. Her visions dictated the timing of campaigns, the selection of generals, and the allocation of resources. One crack of a bone, one sign from a bird, could determine the fate of an entire army, redirecting thousands of men across unforgiving plains. Strategy, discipline, courage all were secondary to the messages delivered by spirits that whispered through the shaman's chant. Beyond the yurt, the steppe seemed to listen. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries carrying over the rolling hills, echoing as if the spirits themselves were observing. Clouds moved in deliberate, almost unnatural patterns, their shadows sliding across the grass in ways that made even seasoned scouts pause. Birds fell from the sky at moments that seemed to carry meaning, and streams reflected light in shapes that the shaman interpreted as omens. Soldiers, though skeptical in quieter moments, obeyed the signs unquestioningly. Lives were not risked lightly when the unseen had spoken. As the armies moved, strange events seemed to follow. Storms appeared at critical moments, rivers swelled to prevent or protect movement, and generals who doubted the omens met untimely ends. Chroniclers later wrote of battles that seemed almost preordained, A victory is achieved not by force alone, but by the subtle guidance of supernatural counsel. The shaman's interpretations could save a city or doom an army before a single arrow was fired. Her authority, though invisible, shaped the Mongol Empire's expansion in ways that no historian could fully quantify. Even Genghis Khan, who had conquered more lands than any man before him, knew that human strength alone was fragile. At night, he would sit atop a ridge, watching the firelight of distant camps flicker in the cold wind, listening to the whispers of the shaman and feeling the pulse of the steppe beneath him. He understood that even the mightiest warriors were subservient to currents they could not see, that victory and death were often dictated by omens interpreted by a woman crouched over fire and bone. The shaman's influence extended beyond individual campaigns. Her readings reshaped diplomacy, preempted rebellions, and redirected the movement of entire provinces. Cities fell or survived according to patterns no mortal could fully grasp. Historians who attempted to reconstruct events spoke of coincidences, but the Mongols themselves knew better. History had been guided by whispers and shadows, by the fragile, sacred knowledge passed from ancestor to the shaman, and through her, to the great Khan. In the stillness of the steppe at night, with only the wind and the distant cries of animals, one can imagine the shaman's chants rising into the sky, bending the fate of empires with unseen hands. Armies moved as if possessed by the will of spirits. Generals obeyed signs that could not be questioned, and the Khan, though feared across continents, bowed to the authority of the sacred. The Mongol Empire, vast and unstoppable in its conquests, was a living testament to the subtle, terrifying power of superstition. Even centuries later, the steppe remembers. The wind carries echoes of chants, the whispers of omens, and the faint, lingering presence of a shaman whose guidance could decide the fate of men and nations alike. It is a reminder that human ambition, no matter how great, bends before the unseen. That history is shaped not only by armies and law, but by fragile, sacred currents of belief. And in that space between wind and grass, hoofbeats and shadows, the invisible hand of superstition continues to guide, as it always has, the destinies of those who dare to listen. In the mist-laden valleys of Heian-era Japan, the mountains seemed alive with whispers. Trees bowed under the weight of dew, their leaves trembling as if carrying messages from the unseen. The wind moved silently through bamboo groves, curling around the temples and palaces of Kyoto with an almost sentient grace. In this delicate, shadowed world, not all power was measured in armies or decrees. Some forces were invisible, cunning, and infinitely patient. Among them were the fox spirits, kitsune creatures of myth said to embody both mischief and malign will. And for the emperor, their influence was not to be underestimated. Emperor Siwa, a young ruler of cautious temperament, walked through the corridors of his palace with a measured tread. Behind the silk screens, courtiers whispered, their eyes darting nervously to the edges of the rooms where shadows pooled thickly, where a glimpse of red-gold eyes might vanish as quickly as it appeared. Legends told that kitsune could assume the form of humans, sow discord, and even shape destiny with subtle tricks invisible to ordinary men. In the palace, the line between reality and superstition was perilously thin. Siwa, aware of the stories and omens surrounding his reign, feared the fox's cleverness almost as much as any rival clan. At night, the emperor's chambers were illuminated by the pale glow of oil lamps. The scent of incense, sandalwood, and damp moss clung to the air. Shinto priests, summoned in secret, moved quietly among the tatami mats, chanting prayers to ward off malevolent spirits. They burned sacred talismans and whispered incantations meant to reveal fox trickery before it could harm the empire. Every creak of the wooden floors, every flicker of shadow cast by the lamps was scrutinized. Even a stray fox caught on the palace grounds was seen as an omen, its behavior recorded, interpreted, and sometimes feared as a harbinger of betrayal or misfortune. Outside the palace, Kyoto slept beneath a silvered moon, unaware of the anxious eyes that watched for signs of trickery. A distant fox cried somewhere in the hills, its voice curling like smoke through the night. Soldiers patrolled silently and courtiers clutched charms, hoping to shield themselves from unseen mischief. In one tale, a fox spirit had supposedly taken the form of a trusted advisor, whispering false counsel that almost led to a rebellion. The emperor, alerted by the priests, acted decisively. The advisor was removed. The palace cleansed in ritual, and the fox's influence was feared to have been purged, though no mortal could be certain. This tension between the mundane and the mystical defined the rhythm of the court. Every decision was shadowed by the possibility of trickery. every alliance potentially guided by invisible paws and shifting eyes. Festivals were punctuated with rituals to honor and appease spirits. Even the emperor's private movements were subject to prayers and talismans. The kitsune were respected and feared in equal measure, their subtle presence shaping diplomacy, military movements, and personal lives in ways both profound and silent. Despite these precautions, uncertainty lingered like fog along the palace corridors. Nothing in history could prove which events were influenced by human ambition, and which by fox spirits cunning enough to remain unseen. Wars were avoided or begun at moments when a fox's omen was interpreted favorably. Marriages arranged or annulled in the quiet council of priests. Emissaries sent or recalled based on whispered messages carried by wind, shadow, and instinct. The emperor's vigilance against this invisible threat defined his reign, as much as his skill in governance or strategy. In the long nights, when the palace fell silent, Siwa would sit alone, listening to the rustle of bamboo and the distant cries of nocturnal creatures. He would ponder the delicate balance between fear and wisdom, between belief and action. The kitsune, though unseen, governed as surely as the stars above. The emperor understood that superstition was not mere folly, it was a force that shaped decisions, preserved empires, and warned of dangers that human senses could not detect. Even centuries later, the story of Siwa and the fox spirits persists as a testament to the power of unseen influence. The mountains still whisper, the bamboo still bends under the wind, and the tales of trickery and vigilance endure, reminding us that human authority, however vast, is never entirely free from forces it cannot see. The kitsune may be myth, but the fear it inspired, the rituals it demanded, and the caution it instilled were very real. In this fragile tension between the known and unknown, the emperor, like all who wield power, was made humble, bound to a world in which even the smallest shadow could sway the fate of a nation. As dawn broke over Kyoto, pale and delicate, the city awoke to another day, seemingly ordinary yet indelibly shaped by the invisible hands of superstition. The emperor's eyes, reflecting the morning light, carried the weight of vigilance. Every shadow, every rustle of wind through bamboo, remained a reminder that unseen forces shape history as profoundly as armies, alliances, and law. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, a fox stirred in the mist, invisible yet eternal, watching, waiting, and whispering its timeless counsel to those wise or fearful enough to heed it. The fjords of Scandinavia glimmered under a cold, pale sun, their waters still and dark, reflecting the jagged teeth of mountains that had stood for centuries, as silent witnesses to the rise and fall of men. Mist clung stubbornly to the valleys, curling around pine and rock, moving like the slow breath of ancient spirits. In this austere and unforgiving land, the Norse people understood that the mightiest king could be toppled not by sword alone, but by the unseen currents of fate, whispered through the mouth of a seer, glimpsed in runes carved upon wood and bone. In a small hall of timber and smoke, hidden among the forests near a frozen river, the seer sat cross-legged, surrounded by flickering candles whose light danced across walls blackened with age and soot. Her hair was silvered, her eyes luminous, as if reflecting both the past and the future simultaneously. Kings, warriors, and envoys came to her in secret, seeking guidance and reassurance, for she was believed to know the threads of destiny that intertwined with every life in the kingdom. Runes, bones, and visions were her language, and her interpretations were law for those who feared the consequences of ignoring what the gods had spoken. King Harald Fairhair, his brow furrowed and hands calloused from battle, stood before her one winter evening. The air was thick with smoke and the tang of dried fish, of frostbitten pine, of candles burning low. Harald sought to know the fate of his realm, the loyalties of his jarls, and the dangers that lurked beyond the horizon. The seer traced runes in the sand, dropping carved symbols with meticulous precision. Each mark, each arrangement, each flicker of candlelight reflected potential paths, some of triumph, others of betrayal, others still leading to death. She spoke in a voice that trembled like wind over icy waters. The wolf will rise where the lamb is trusted. Blood will fall before the sun reaches its zenith. A crown may shine, yet the hand that wears it will tremble in shadow. The king, hardened by campaigns and the endless cruelty of conquest, felt a shiver run through him, a rare crack. In his armor of certainty, the seer's visions were not mere superstition. They were lived experience made sacred, an intimate reckoning with the threads of mortality and destiny. Courtiers whispered that her predictions had toppled kings before, that leaders who ignored her warnings were found lifeless in the snow, their deaths as mysterious as the mist rolling through the valleys. Warriors and peasants alike trembled at the knowledge that their lives were tethered to words spoken in a flickering hall of shadows. Beyond the hall, the world seemed to respond to her presence. Winds shifted unpredictably, rivers swelled or froze, and birds flew in patterns that some claimed mirrored the pulse of fate she foresaw. The seer's influence extended far beyond her small chamber. She determined when campaigns would begin or end, which alliances were safe, and which rivals harbored secret treachery. Even kings' strategies, seemingly rational and measured, were altered at her counsel. Their triumphs or failures intertwined with visions read in bones and symbols, with warnings whispered in riddles and shadowed metaphors. As weeks passed, Harold took counsel from the seer before every campaign. Some of her predictions were vague, others precise and chilling. A Jarl's betrayal came exactly as she had suggested. A winter siege ended in disaster despite superior numbers, as if the gods themselves had intervened. Yet her guidance also preserved life, rivers crossed safely, ambushes avoided, alliances strengthened through her insight. To the king, she was both oracle and guardian, a reminder that no amount of courage or cunning could bend the immutable rules of fate. Even in solitude, Harold reflected on the seer's power. Alone in his hall, he would gaze through the frost-laced windows, watching the moonlight shimmer across snow and ice. He considered that life, for all its victories and conquests, was fragile before the currents of the unseen. One misstep, one ignored warning, and an empire or a life could vanish as silently as mist over the fjord. The seer's presence was a constant reminder that the world was not governed solely by strength, but by knowledge, intuition, and the delicate, terrifying influence of forces beyond mortal comprehension. Centuries later, the story of the Viking seer persists, carried in sagas and whispered in folklore. The runes she traced, the bones she cast, and the vision she interpreted remain symbols of humanity's fascination with destiny, the fragile boundary between knowledge and faith, and the subtle authority that superstition can wield over even the strongest rulers. The fjords, the forests, and the mountains remember her voice, and in the quiet rustle of leaves, the creak of timber hulls, or the flight of a lone raven across the ice, one can almost hear her words echo. Blood will fall, shadows will shift, and the crown will tremble before the unseen. In the stillness of the northern night, the seer's influence lingers. She reminds us that history is rarely a product of mere ambition or strength, that the fate of men and empires is bound as much to whispers, symbols, and sacred insight as it is to sword, law, or gold. The Viking world, wild and unyielding, bows to the unseen currents that guide mortal lives, and even now, the wind across the fjords carries her voice, invisible but eternal, shaping destiny one whispered vision at a time. The sands of Egypt shimmered beneath the relentless sun, stretching endlessly toward the horizon where the Nile wound like a silver serpent. Through the desert, the air was thick with heat and a faint, lingering scent of incense and crushed papyrus. Tombs rose from the earth like jagged teeth, their entrances dark and silent, guarding secrets older than the memory of men. Among these ancient monuments, one force held more power than kings, armies, or even gods: the curse of the pharaoh, an invisible sentinel capable of turning conquest into ruin and triumph into despair. It was during the New Kingdom that armies, proud and disciplined, found themselves undone by what they could neither see nor understand. Pharaohs, rulers cloaked in gold and divinity, were thought to leave more than tombs behind. They left warnings carved into stone and curses meant to protect their eternal rest. Soldiers who entered forbidden chambers sometimes fell ill inexplicably. Leaders died suddenly, stricken by fever or accident, while others whispered of unseen hands moving through their ranks. The desert, silent and unforgiving, seemed complicit in the punishment, its winds scattering sand like talons against those who dared disturb the sacred. One such story tells of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, whose tomb lay deep beneath the Valley of the Kings. A foreign army, ambitious and arrogant, had marched toward Thebes, hoping to seize the riches of the Nile. Their path led them past temples and shrines, through the low hum of the city, past priests who murmured warnings to anyone who would listen. But the army, deafened by pride, pressed on, disregarding the carved inscriptions that promised death to any who defiled the resting place of a king. That night, as torches flickered against stone walls and soldiers set up camp in the valley, a sudden chill spread through the desert. It was unnatural, a cold that burned the skin and silenced the air, as if the tomb itself exhaled its wrath. By dawn, confusion reigned. Horses bolted without warning, Riders fell into hidden pits, and leaders awoke to find entire divisions stricken. With illness, rumors spread that the pharaoh's spirit had walked among the ranks, marking transgressors for punishment. Every attempt to advance, to cross the river or scale the hills toward the city, was met with inexplicable misfortune. Supplies spoiled, bridges collapsed, and desert storms rose from nowhere, burying men and horses beneath dunes. The army, once confident and roaring with ambition, retreated in terror, believing that the curse was real, that a divine hand guided their destruction. Inside the tomb, the sarcophagus remained undisturbed, the inscription silent but potent. Hieroglyphs etched into stone spoke of vengeance, guardianship, and the eternal vigilance of a ruler who could not be disturbed even in death. The priests of Thebes watched from their temples, offering prayers and incense. Knowing that the curse had succeeded without their interference, the king's spirit, they believed, had protected both his tomb and the city, bending the course of human ambition with the subtle power of fear and superstition. Even for the pharaohs themselves, the curse was a double-edged sword, a reminder that mortal life was fragile and the desert eternal. Kings, generals, and commoners alike were made aware that the invisible rules of the sacred outweighed the calculations of strategy and the might of armies. In the quiet of the night, one could almost hear the whisper of sand across stone, the sigh of eternity from within the tomb, warning that to disturb what belonged to the divine was to invite chaos and death. Historians who later attempted to reconstruct these events were left with fragmentary accounts. A soldier's diary describing fever and madness, a priest's chronicle recounting divine wrath, or hieroglyphs hinting at consequences beyond comprehension. Some argued that the curse was coincidence, disease, or the desert's cruelty. Yet the contemporary witnesses, fearful and awed, saw something more profound, a sacred force guiding the fate of mortals, bending even the most organized and powerful human endeavor to its will. The pharaoh's curses endure in memory, preserved in tombs, scrolls, and the whispers of the desert wind. They serve as a testament to the potent intersection of superstition, fear, and human vulnerability. Armies that thought themselves unstoppable could be felled by invisible hands, leaders humbled by forces unseen, and the course of history subtly reshaped by belief as much as by sword. The sands, unchanging yet always moving, became both witness and instrument, carrying the silent warning that mortal ambition must bow before the sacred and the eternal. Even today, travelers in the Valley of the Kings sense it, the heat and silence, the weight of stone, the soft whisper of wind that seems to carry voices from the past. The tombs stand, eternal and inviolate, guarding secrets and echoing the power of superstition that once halted armies, toppled leaders, and shaped the destiny of an empire. And in the quiet, beneath the vast, unyielding sky, one can imagine the pharaoh's spirit watching still, a sentinel of the eternal desert, reminding all who enter that some forces, though invisible, are absolute, and that the curse of a king, born of reverence and fear, can wield more power than any army, no matter how mighty. The streets of Paris were shrouded in fog, the narrow alleys and cobblestones slick with a damp that seemed almost alive, curling around the feet of those who dared to walk them after dark. Lanterns cast flickering pools of light, illuminating faces half hidden in shadow, while the spires of Notre Dame loomed above like silent sentinels. In the year 1307, the city trembled under a fear unseen yet deeply felt, an omen whispered by those who understood the precarious balance between power, secrecy, and divine judgment. The Knights Templar, guardians of the Holy Land and keepers of arcane knowledge, held secrets that could topple King's End on this night. The empire itself seemed to bend beneath the weight of superstition. Within the shadowed halls of the Templar preceptory, candles burned low, casting long, quivering shadows across stone walls carved with sigils and symbols known only to the initiated. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, moved with deliberate gravity, consulting parchments that chronicled visions, celestial alignments, and cryptic messages from distant lands. It was said that the Templars had preserved knowledge of omens that could alter the fate of kingdoms, messages carried in dreams, stars, and whispered counsel. On this particular night, a vision had arrived, strange and portentous, a comet slicing across the sky, its tail flickering crimson, seen by astronomers and monks alike, interpreted by the Templars as a warning, the fall of rulers, the upheaval of dynasties, the unraveling of what men called order. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, had long coveted the wealth and influence of the Templars. Yet he feared the power that could not be measured in gold or armies. The omen, carried secretly to the king by agents and spies, hinted at catastrophe should he act against the order. The comet's passage, the alignment of stars, and the whispers of the Templar seers were interpreted as signs of divine will and invisible hand, cautioning kings that arrogance can summon ruin. Still, ambition outweighed fear. Philip's advisors urged preemptive action, and the wheels of fate, guided by superstition, began to turn. In the weeks that followed, the rest of the Templars was swift and chilling. Midnight raids swept through Paris and across France. Nights were seized in silence, their faces etched with shock, their oaths of secrecy rendered irrelevant by the king's authority and the perceived inevitability of the omen. Rumors spread that the very heavens had conspired to warn the king of treachery within his kingdom, that the comet's crimson tail was a herald of judgment. And yet, as Templars were tortured, imprisoned, and executed, the kingdom itself seemed to falter. Supplies dwindled, alliances fractured, and whispers of rebellion grew louder in distant provinces. Historians later speculated whether coincidence or superstition had guided these events, but contemporary witnesses understood differently. The omen had shaped the decisions of kings, bending history in ways both subtle and catastrophic. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was brought to Paris, old and worn, but unbroken in spirit. In secret councils and whispered warnings, he had tried to interpret the signs for the king, to redirect the course of fate, but ambition is deaf to caution when blinded by greed. On the night of his execution, as flames licked the scaffold, the seers claimed to see omens that forewarned the king's own downfall. The smoke curled skyward, the stars shivered, and a hush fell over Paris as though the city itself acknowledged the injustice. Philip would die within the year, his empire shaken, his heirs contested, and the Templars' warning realized. The unseen currents of fate, whispered through omens and stars, had claimed their due. Even today, the comet's passage and the Templars' interpretation linger in memory. Preserved in fragments of chronicles, legends, and myths, their influence reminds us that empires, no matter how vast or disciplined, are vulnerable to forces invisible and inscrutable. The Templars had known that knowledge, when intertwined with superstition, could wield power greater than armies or wealth, and that the fate of kings was often guided not by strategy alone, but by omens read in the sky, the whisper of stars, and the insight of those attuned to the sacred and unseen. Walking through the narrow streets of modern Paris, one can almost sense the echoes of that night, the shadowed lanterns, the whispered warnings, the trembling of the powerful before what could not be fully understood. History, it seems, bends, not only under the weight of conquest and ambition, but also beneath the quiet authority of science. Interpreted with reverence and fear, the Templars' legacy endures as a testament to the subtle, unyielding force of superstition, the knowledge that even the mightiest rulers must sometimes bow before omens, lest their crowns and empires crumble in the shadow of the unseen. And so, in the stillness of night, as stars trace silent paths across the sky, the story of the Templars' omen persists, a reminder that power, wealth, and ambition are fragile when confronted with the invisible threads that shape destiny, and that the fall of kings is sometimes orchestrated not by swords or law, but by whispers carried on the wind, by visions seen in the heavens, and by the timeless, sacred hand of superstition guiding men beyond their understanding. High atop the jagged slopes of Mount Parnassus, the air shimmered with heat and mystery, carrying the scent of wild thyme, pine resin, and the faint, almost electric tang of unseen forces. The valley below stretched like a tapestry of green and gold, rivers curling through it as if tracing the contours of destiny itself. Here, in the sacred precinct of Delphi, the Pythia, the oracle of Apollo, sat upon her tripod, inhaling vapors that rose from the chasm beneath the earth. Her voice, when it emerged, was a tremulous thread, woven with the authority of gods and the weight of centuries. Empires, it was said, rose and fell upon her words, whispered in riddles that could humble kings and shape the fate of nations. It was the 5th century BCE, and Athens, proud and ambitious, had extended its reach across the Greek world, its fleets powerful, its armies disciplined, its influence seemingly unassailable. Yet the leaders of the city knew that arrogance could blind even the wisest, and that the gods, speaking through the oracle, demanded caution and reverence. Kings, generals, and envoys would make the pilgrimage to Delphi, their minds heavy with hope and fear, their hearts trembling at the thought of divine judgment. For those who sought the Pythia's counsel, the words delivered were rarely clear, but their consequences were absolute. One such mission brought a delegation from Athens, seeking guidance before a campaign against a rival city-state. The priests led them through the stone-paved sanctuary, past the statues of Apollo and the murals depicting heroes and gods, each step echoing with sacred authority. The Pythia sat above a fissure in the earth, her eyes clouded and distant, lips moving as if conversing with invisible beings. The vapors that rose from the chasm swirled around her, carrying her voice in a haunting cadence. But where the might that blinds, the pride that falters, for the walls you trust may become your tomb, and the winds of fortune may turn against the swiftest fleet. The envoys, though puzzled by the cryptic warning, carried it back to Athens, where generals and magistrates debated its meaning. Some dismissed it as poetic ambiguity, yet others, steeped in superstition and reverence for divine counsel, took it seriously. When the campaign began, strange events unfolded that seemed to confirm the oracle's words. Winds changed abruptly, scattering triremes. Supplies were lost to fire and flood, alliances wavered as trusted allies betrayed intentions, and victories slipped through the city's grasp. The Athenian leaders, forced to adapt to circumstances beyond comprehension, realized the full weight of Delphi's warning. Pride and strategy alone were insufficient. Over time, the oracle's counsel influenced every major decision, from war to diplomacy to internal governance. Even when her words were cryptic, their interpretation shaped the course of history. Empires rose or fell not only through human ambition, courage, or skill, but through the invisible currents of superstition that ran like rivers beneath the surface of political and military life. Delphi, silent and unchanging, exerted its influence through whispers and riddles, bending the course of men as subtly and inevitably as the wind shaping the slopes of Parnassus. The Athenian experience was repeated across the Greek world. Cities sought Delphi's counsel to predict harvests, to anticipate invasions, and to judge the loyalty of allies. Kings and generals, aware of their own vulnerability, bowed to the oracle's authority, altering campaigns, postponing sieges, and revising strategies in deference to her warnings. Even those who doubted the supernatural influence of the oracle could not escape the consequences of decisions shaped by her pronouncements, for superstition had become interwoven with policy, war, and survival. In moments of quiet reflection, one can imagine the Pythia inhaling the sacred fumes, her words rising in vapors that drifted down the mountainside, entering the minds and hearts of rulers and citizens alike. The oracle's influence was invisible, yet absolute. She did not command armies, nor did she wield wealth, yet her pronouncements could topple kings and humble empires. To consult Delphi was to acknowledge the delicate balance between mortal endeavor and divine oversight, the understanding that human power, however formidable, is fragile when confronted by forces unseen but omnipresent. Even centuries later, the sanctuary of Delphi stands as a testament to the enduring power of superstition and belief. The ruins, silent and overgrown, carry the echoes of footsteps long gone, of whispers in the stone, and of voices that once issued riddles capable of bending the course of history. The oracle reminds us that human ambition is rarely absolute, that even the most disciplined armies and the most confident leaders are subject to forces beyond comprehension. Delphi's power lay not in might, but in the quiet authority of what could not be fully explained, shaping decisions and outcomes with a subtle, unyielding hand. And so, beneath the jagged peaks of Parnassus, where the air is thin and the earth trembles with memory, one can almost hear the oracle's voice carried on the wind, a reminder that empires, no matter how vast or disciplined, are always vulnerable to the unseen, that history is not merely written by swords or law, but by the sacred currents of superstition, foresight, and reverence. In the hush of the mountains, in the shimmer of river and valley, the oracle's whisper endures, eternal and enigmatic, a force capable of humbling the proudest rulers and shaping the destiny of nations. In the frozen heart of Moscow, where the winter wind sliced through the streets like a sharpened blade, the Kremlin loomed as both fortress and prison. Its towers, draped in frost and shadow, held the whispers of centuries, echoing the triumphs and terrors of rulers who had walked its halls. Among them was Tsar Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, a man whose reign was as cruel as it was brilliant, whose mind teetered on the edge of genius and madness. And yet, for all his power, it was not armies, politics, or rebellion that haunted him most, but shadows. The Tsar's fear was neither simple nor rational. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of Ivan's obsession with omens and superstition, of the belief that darkness itself could be alive with malevolent intent. Shadows, whether cast by candlelight or the moon on snow, were not mere absence of light, but vessels of warning and danger, capable of harboring spirits, spies, and unseen enemies. Every corridor, every vaulted hall, every corner of the Kremlin became a stage for vigilance and dread. Guards were posted not only to defend against human threats, but to watch for inexplicable movements, to anticipate the mischief that could emerge from the darkness. Ivan himself would move through the palace in the dead of night, accompanied by priests and astrologers, his eyes scanning the flickering gloom for signs of danger. Candles cast trembling forms against the stone walls, and he would pause, listening to the faintest creak of floorboards or rustle of tapestries, convinced that the shadows themselves were alive with intent. Priests whispered protective incantations, burning herbs and chalking symbols on doorways, seeking to ward off spirits that might harbor resentment, vengeance, or prophecy. In the Tsar's mind, no corner of the palace was truly safe, for the unseen often carried messages that flesh and steel could not intercept. The fear of shadows influenced every decision. Military campaigns were delayed or accelerated based on astrological readings, and interpretations of omens. Personal councils were chosen not only for loyalty, but for their sensitivity to supernatural signals. Courtiers lived under constant scrutiny, their own movements interpreted as potential threats. Their shadows on the walls watched with almost obsessive care. Ivan's paranoia, amplified by superstition, shaped the governance of the entire Russian realm. Even minor accidents, a horse stumbling, a candle guttering, were taken as warnings from forces unseen, guiding the Tsar's choices and altering the course of events in ways both subtle and profound. One chronicler tells of a winter evening, when Ivan convened his advisors in the hall of stone columns, the air thick with smoke and incense. The moon, hidden behind clouds, cast fleeting shadows across the walls, and the Tsar's gaze followed, each one with an intensity that unsettled even the bravest courtiers. "Do you see it?" he asked, voice low and tremulous. "Do you see what lingers where no one stands?" The advisors, wary, murmured reassurances, yet no explanation could satisfy the Tsar. That night, he altered the positions of his troops in the city, adjusted his policies to ward neighboring states, and reinforce palace defenses. All of this was guided not by reason alone, but by the subtle, imperceptible influence of shadows and the unseen forces they represented. Even in private, Ivan's fear shaped his personal life. Walks through the gardens were accompanied by priests chanting prayers. Meals were taken under the scrutiny of protective charms and incantations. Sleep was guarded by wards and rituals, for the Tsar believed that the night itself could carry malice. Friends and enemies alike recognized that to influence Ivan, one had to understand the shadowed corridors of his mind as much as the politics of Moscow, for superstition had become inseparable from authority. In hindsight, historians see Ivan's fear of shadows as paranoia, a symptom of absolute power and isolation. Yet in the contemporary context, his belief was coherent and rational within a world where superstition governed perception as much as reality. Shadows were interpreted as portents, and the Tsar's attention to them influenced policy, warfare, and alliances. Moscow itself seemed to bend to his fears, its streets and halls echoing with the subtle authority of superstition, guiding the empire in ways no chronicler could fully quantify. Even centuries later, the memory of Ivan's shadowed vigilance lingers in the Kremlin, in the frostbitten corridors, the echoing halls, and the darkened corners where sunlight barely reaches. The fear of unseen forces, of what lurks just beyond perception, shaped one of history's most formidable rulers, reminding us that human power is never absolute, that the mind, though capable of genius and cruelty, is also vulnerable to the subtle, eternal currents of superstition. Walking through Moscow on a winter night, when the wind howls across the frozen river and the Kremlin towers loom like specters, one can almost imagine Ivan pacing the halls, eyes following shadows that no one else can see. The candles flicker, the stone is cold, and the faintest movements in the darkness seem to carry messages meant only for him. In this space between light and dark, between history and legend, one realizes that superstition shaped not only the Tsar's reign, but the destiny of Russia itself, guiding decisions, instilling fear, and demonstrating that the unseen, however silent, can wield power more profound than armies, laws, or crowns. And so, the tale of the Russian Tsar, who feared shadows, endures a testament to the subtle, haunting influence of superstition over human authority. a reminder that even the mightiest rulers are bound by what they cannot see, and that history, in its deepest currents, is shaped as much by fear and belief as by strategy, ambition, and conquest. Along the mist-draped banks of the Yellow River, the morning sun broke over the mountains in molten gold, spilling light across temples and palaces that seemed to float between heaven and earth. In the Forbidden City, the Emperor of China walked, alone through halls of carved wood and lacquered stone, his robes whispering against the polished floors. Though the empire stretched vast and mighty, with armies that could crush kingdoms and scholars who preserved the wisdom of centuries, the emperor's greatest counsel came not from ministers or generals, but from dragons, creatures of legend, power, and celestial authority. It was the Ming Dynasty, a time of consolidation and ritual, when superstition and statecraft intertwined like threads of silk. The emperor believed that dragons, both earthly and heavenly, could see the currents of fate that humans could not. They were the embodiment of the cosmos' will, capable of guiding harvests, warning of rebellion, and even shaping the destiny of rulers. Priests and seers interpreted their signs, the way water rippled in dragon-shaped basins, the curling of smoke from incense burned in dragon-shaped braziers, the patterns formed by clouds drifting over mountains in the distance. Every movement, every gesture, was considered an expression of the dragon's will. In the throne room, the emperor would consult scrolls detailing sightings of dragons along the rivers and mountains. Courtiers, uneasy and reverent, recorded omens. A dragon's shadow gliding across the imperial garden might foretell war. A reflection in a ceremonial pool could indicate treachery among ministers. The emperor's advisors, bound by duty and superstition, interpreted these signals with the utmost care. Every edict issued, every campaign launched, every palace intrigue managed was filtered through the lens of dragon counsel. To ignore these signs was to invite calamity, for dragons, it was believed, could withhold their protection or unleash ruin with equal subtlety. One particular spring, the emperor observed a rare celestial alignment above the mountains. Interpreted as a message from the celestial dragon, the winds carried the scent of wet earth. The river churned with unexpected currents, and the clouds above formed shapes that the astrologers insisted were symbols of betrayal in the north. Acting on these omens, the emperor delayed military campaigns, repositioned fleets, and reshuffled ministers, actions that later prevented what historians might call a civil disaster. Without the guidance of the dragons, human arrogance might have led to bloodshed, famine, or the collapse of his rule. Even private life was entwined with dragon consultation. Gardens were arranged according to celestial flow, rivers were diverted to mirror the curves of dragons in legend. Feasts were timed with eclipses or atmospheric phenomena thought to indicate the creature's favor. The emperor moved with careful calculation, aware that dragons, invisible and eternal, judged every decision, every misstep, every act of ambition. Ministers and generals, though outwardly loyal, understood that even the smallest ripple in a dragon-shaped pool could influence imperial favor or doom. At night, when lanterns flickered against red-painted walls and the city slept beneath a star-strewn sky, the emperor would climb terraces overlooking the river, gazing into the mist. There, the silhouettes of mountains and clouds merged into shapes that human eyes might mistake for ordinary landscape, but he saw dragons curving, twisting, luminous in his mind's eye, guiding, judging, whispering the fate of his empire. He understood that the strength of armies and the wisdom of ministers paled in comparison to the subtle, inexorable will of these supernatural guardians. Even centuries later, the influence of dragons lingers in the stories, gardens, and architecture of China. Rivers still bend with a dragon's curve, temples still honor celestial creatures, and the belief in signs from the invisible world persists in whispers of tradition. The emperor's reliance on dragons reminds us that superstition, when entwined with authority, shapes history in ways that human observation alone cannot explain. It is a force invisible yet absolute, guiding decisions, protecting empires, and humbling rulers who forget that the world is larger than their eyes, more subtle than their minds, and more enduring than their power. Walking along the banks of the Yellow River today, when mist rises like spirits from the water and the mountains hold their silence, one can imagine the emperor watching, consulting, and listening to the currents of dragon wisdom. His empire, vast and ordered, bowed not only to human strength, but to the delicate, invisible authority of legend, fear, and reverence. In the quiet curve of the river, in the shifting clouds, in the ripple of incense smoke, The dragon's counsel endures, shaping the unseen course of history, a reminder that even emperors, masters of armies and law, are guided by the subtle hand of superstition, eternal, invisible, and absolute. In the cold, stone halls of Westminster, shadows clung to the corners like restless spirits. The flickering glow of torches cast long, wavering shapes across tapestries depicting battles, saints, and kings long dead. It was the 17th century, a time of crowns, conspiracies, and whispers. And yet the most potent fear of one English monarch was not rebellion or invasion, but the silent, green-eyed gaze of a black cat. Charles I, proud, devout, and meticulous in his rituals, believed that these creatures were omens of death, spies of misfortune, and sometimes vessels of witchcraft. In his eyes, the smallest movement of fur in the shadows could alter the fate of a kingdom. The king's fear was rooted in legend and experience. Courtiers whispered of black cats appearing on the eve of plague, of mysterious fires in households where one prowled, and of soldiers falling ill or dying after a black cat crossed their path. Charles, though a man of intellect and faith, could not dismiss such stories. He ordered that black cats be observed closely, that their movements be recorded, and that any crossing of thresholds, whether in the palace or on a battlefield, be interpreted as a sign from the invisible world. His generals and advisers, whether they believed in the superstition or feared the king's reaction, accommodated his anxiety. Decisions, strategies, and even minor ceremonies were colored by the shifting, furtive presence of these nocturnal creatures. On one particularly tense spring, rumors reached Charles that a black cat had been sighted near the royal armory, its eyes reflecting torchlight as it slinked among the barrels of powder and stacks of armor. The king's advisers were summoned immediately. Soldiers were sent to drive the animal away, priests performed protective rituals, and charms were hung from walls and ceilings. The king himself inspected the armory daily, convinced that the cat's presence could portend betrayal, fire, or even the loss of life in upcoming conflicts. It was said that Charles would not enter a room if he suspected a black cat had been there, until it had been thoroughly cleansed with incense and prayer. Even the court ceremonies were subtly influenced by this fear. Banquets were arranged with careful attention to thresholds, entrances, and exits. Meetings were timed according to when the sun struck certain windows in the palace, casting shadows that might mask the approach of a feline messenger of doom. Servants moved quietly, eyes alert for the slightest movement of black fur, while courtiers whispered prayers under their breath. The king's obsession became a thread that ran through daily life, affecting morale, discipline, and the timing of decisions that would ripple through the nation. When war loomed with the parliamentarians, Charles's attention to omens grew more intense. Every journey, every council, every deployment was subject to divination. The sighting of a black cat on the road could delay an army. The appearance of one in a window could alter the placement of troops. Generals, already cautious, found themselves interpreting natural occurrences as supernatural signs, adapting strategies based on superstition as much as on intelligence or terrain. History records the king's military failures, his capture, and eventual execution. And though historians cite political miscalculations and civil unrest, it is whispered in folklore that the invisible paw of superstition, embodied in black cats, guided both fear and hesitation throughout his reign. In private chambers, Charles's fear persisted even in solitude. He would pace the floors at night, listening for the quietest rustle, imagining the brush of fur against stone, the glint of eyes in candlelight. Even his sleep was guarded, windows shuttered, floors swept, and charms placed strategically to protect against malevolent forces. The king's devotion to ritual, his obsession with omens, shaped his life and decisions, illustrating the profound influence of superstition on human authority. What may appear trivial to the modern eye, fear of a cat was to him a matter of life, empire, and divine justice. Even centuries later, the tale of Charles and the black cats endures, a haunting reminder of how superstition can infiltrate the corridors of power. The monarchy, the courts, the very structure of decision-making were subtly molded by the fear of unseen forces, by the belief that a creature so small could wield influence over kings and armies. Westminster itself seems to retain the echoes of that vigilance, the creak of floors, the sway of shadows, and the quiet, fleeting presence of something unseen, watching, waiting, judging. In the stillness of night, when the wind whistles along the frozen Thames and torches cast shadows across ancient stone, one can almost imagine Charles I pacing the halls, eyes following the faintest flicker of fur, listening to the quiet rhythm of paws on marble. The kingdom, vast and disciplined, was made fragile by the unseen, a testament to the enduring power of superstition and a reminder that even kings, rulers of men and armies, are never fully masters of the forces they fear most. And so, the story of the English king who feared black cats endures a whisper in history, a shadow in legend, and a lesson that human ambition, no matter how grand, bends before the invisible, the mysterious, and the timeless authority of superstition. Even the smallest shadow can shape destiny, and in the quiet, green-eyed gaze of a black cat, the fate of an empire may tremble. Beneath the blazing sun of the Valley of Mexico, the city of Tenochtitlan shimmered like a jewel upon its lake, its canals glinting silver in the heat, and pyramids rising like stone mountains from the waters. The air was heavy with incense, the scent of copal mingling with the earthy perfume of maize and mud. Here, amidst temples carved with serpents and jaguars, the Aztec priests practiced a ritual older than memory, one that intertwined human life, divine will, and the unpredictable forces of nature. They believed that the rhythm of rain, the fertility of fields, and the survival of their empire could be foretold and ensured through blood. The priests, robed in feathers and gold, moved through the plazas with solemn steps, their eyes fixed upon the heavens, observing the flight of birds, the patterns of clouds, the behavior of animals. They saw signs of the coming seasons. Yet these signs were not merely interpreted, they were acted upon. To predict rain, to coax the favor of Tlaloc, the god of water, required offering life itself. Captives, chosen from distant wars or local tributes, were led to the summit of the temple pyramids, their bodies placed against stone altars carved with intricate glyphs. The priests' knives glinted in the sunlight as they drew blood in precise, ritualistic motions, releasing it to the sky with chants and prayers, believing it to nourish the gods and ensure the clouds would yield rain. It was during a particularly harsh dry season that the stakes of the ritual became painfully clear. Crops were withering, canals shrank, and the city's people murmured anxiously about famine. The emperor himself watched from a distance, understanding that the empire's survival rested on the precision and authority of the priests. The ritual commenced at dawn, a procession of color, sound, and scent as incense smoke curled around the pyramids like living serpents. The priests' chants rose and fell in cadence, each syllable believed to carry the essence of life to the gods, each drop of blood a plea for mercy from the parched sky. As the ceremony unfolded, clouds began to gather over the mountains, swirling ominously, shifting in patterns that the priests interpreted as approval or disfavor. Some believed that the ceremony's success was immediate, that the gods had accepted the offering and would grant water to the fields and canals. Others whispered that mistakes in the ritual, the angle of a blade, the placement of a victim, or the rhythm of a chant could turn the omen into disaster, angering the gods instead. In the weeks that followed, rain came in torrents or drought persisted, as if the heavens themselves were weighing each action, each offering, each life taken upon the stone altars of Tenochtitlan. The priest's influence extended far beyond weather. Their interpretations guided military campaigns, political alliances, and internal governance. If the skies remained dry after a ritual, it was seen as a warning. Enemies might advance, plots could unfold, and the empire itself might be threatened. The emperor relied on the priests to read these signs, to discern the invisible threads connecting divine will to earthly power. One miscalculation and incorrectly performed ritual, or a misinterpreted omen, could ripple through the city, causing famine, unrest, or military defeat. Even in moments of quiet reflection, the weight of these rituals was felt. The priests, standing atop the pyramids, gazed at the horizon where earth met sky, understanding that life and death were intertwined with the unseen forces of nature. Their authority was absolute, their knowledge sacred, and their role in shaping history undeniable. Through blood, chant, and ritual, they mediated between the mortal and the divine, wielding superstition as a tool as powerful as any army or law. The story of the Aztec priests endures, carried in codices, ruins, and legend. Their belief in omens and the sacred necessity of offering blood reflects the profound human understanding that survival often depends on forces beyond sight and comprehension. The rituals, violent yet precise, remind us that superstition was not mere belief, but a system of authority and survival, capable of guiding decisions, shaping empires, and determining the fates of thousands. Even today, in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, one can sense the echo of chants, the weight of ritual, the invisible power that once shaped an empire. The terraces of the temples, the carved altars, the silent gaze of jaguar and serpent glyphs all carry the memory of a civilization that listened to the skies, obeyed the omens, and believed that the flow of water and the favor of gods depended on the courage, precision, and sacrifice of mortals. In the stillness of night, when the winds sweep across the valley and the stars glint above the mountains, one can almost hear the priest's chants rising from stone and memory alike, a reminder that superstition shaped life and empire alike. The Aztec people understood that survival, power, and prosperity were never guaranteed, that unseen forces could guide or destroy, and that history was as much written in the ritual, the omen, and the blood offered to the heavens as it was in the acts of kings, generals, or warriors. Thus, the Aztec priests remain eternal in memory, mediators of the divine, arbiters of life and death, and masters of a superstition that governed empires. Their legacy is a haunting testament to the subtle and absolute power of belief, showing that human authority, no matter how great, is always intertwined with forces invisible, eternal, and unknowable, and that the fate of a civilization may hinge upon the precise rhythm of chant, the flow of blood, and the careful reading of omens that reach beyond the mortal eye. The endless steppes of Mongolia stretched beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth whole. Wind swept across the tall grasses like restless spirits, carrying the scent of horses, smoke, and distant mountains. The horizon was broken only by the silhouette of yurts and the occasional figure of a mounted warrior, whose presence seemed as fleeting as the clouds above. It was under this vast, merciless sky that Genghis Khan, the great conqueror, ruled, a man whose ambition stretched as far as the empire he forged, and yet, even he, master of armies and nations, trembled before the appearance of a comet. In the year 1222, the Mongol skies were pierced by a streak of fire, a celestial herald that burned bright and cold against the darkness. Shamans and astrologers declared it an omen. The comet signaled misfortune, death, or the wrath of the heavens. The Khan, whose vision of conquest was matched only by his fear of divine disfavor, took the warning seriously. Comets, it was believed, were the tears of gods, messages from the cosmos carried on blazing trails, portending events beyond mortal control. For Genghis Khan, whose authority rested on both military might and the fear of the unknown, the comet was more than a spectacle. It was a verdict, a caution, and a guide. The Khan summoned his court of shamans and advisors. Smoke from ritual fires filled the tent as incense burned and bones were cast. The shamans spoke in voices both low and reverent, interpreting the comet's trajectory, color, and intensity. Their words were deliberate, each syllable a thread woven into the fabric of destiny. They warned of betrayal among allies, unexpected plagues, and battles that could turn the tide against the Mongol horde if the celestial warning was ignored. The Khan listened, his eyes narrowed, mind calculating, aware that his next decisions must respect the invisible authority of the heavens, lest ambition invite disaster. As campaigns were planned, the influence of superstition became evident. Movements of troops were adjusted to align with auspicious dates dictated by the shamans. Encampments were positioned according to the alignment of the stars and the predicted influence of the comet. Leaders were warned to avoid confrontations during days deemed ill-fated, while envoys were dispatched only when the heavens signaled favor. Every action of the empire, from the march of cavalry to the selection of generals, was subtly shaped by the fear of cosmic retribution. Victory, the Khan understood, was not guaranteed by strength alone. It required respect for signs, omens, and forces beyond human understanding. The comet's influence extended beyond strategy. Genghis Khan's personal rituals became more elaborate, blending military discipline with celestial reverence. Nights were spent on the steppes, observing the stars, consulting shamans, and interpreting portents. Even decisions of governance, laws, tributes, and the treatment of conquered peoples were tempered by omens. Soldiers whispered that the Khan's fear of the celestial would guide not only battle, but the rhythm of daily life in the empire, from the placement of yurts to the timing of hunts. The invisible authority of superstition, as embodied in the blazing comet, reached into every corner of Mongol life, shaping choices and outcomes in ways unseen but undeniable. One chronicler recounts the moment when the comet burned brightest in the sky. Genghis Khan, alone on a ridge, watched its trail dissolve into the night. He felt the weight of eternity pressing against him, the fragility of human ambition exposed beneath the infinite heavens. In that silence, he understood that empires, no matter how vast, were subject to forces beyond mortal calculation, and that even the mightiest Khan must bow to the rhythm of cosmic will. The stars, the shamans, and the blazing comet together formed a web of influence that guided decisions, altered history, and reminded all who dwelled under the vast sky that power is never absolute. Even centuries later, the memory of the Mongol Khan's fear lingers in the steppes, the nomadic plains, the endless sky, and the stories passed down in whispers preserve the lesson that superstition, when intertwined with authority, can shape the destiny of empires. The comet, blazing for only moments yet etched into memory forever, demonstrates the subtle, unyielding influence of forces invisible yet omnipresent. Soldiers, advisors, and rulers alike understood that human endeavor, however disciplined, is fragile before the mysterious, eternal currents of the cosmos. Walking across the steppes today, when the wind sweeps through the grass and the horizon blurs in the sky, one can almost sense Genghis Khan gazing upward, eyes fixed on the heavens, listening to the silent judgment of stars and bending the decisions of an empire before the subtle authority of superstition. The comet, fleeting yet eternal in its memory, reminds us that the fate of nations is often guided by what cannot be seen, that power is tempered by fear, and that the invisible currents of belief can shape history as profoundly as the sword. And so, the tale of the Mongol Khan who feared comets endures a reminder that even the greatest conquerors, masters of thousands, are subject to the immutable will of forces beyond human understanding. Superstition, like the blazing trail of a comet across the night sky, illuminates the delicate threads of destiny, guiding, warning, and humbling rulers whose empires rise and fall beneath its silent gaze. The domes of Istanbul glistened in the early morning sun, their leaden curves reflecting the shimmering waters of the Bosphorus. The call to prayer echoed from minarets, weaving through narrow streets where merchants arranged their wares, and boats drifted along the golden waters like drifting thoughts. Within the Topkapi Palace, where silk banners swayed and candlelight flickered against carved walls, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent moved with quiet contemplation, guided not only by law and counsel, but by dreams. In the empire's heart, he believed that visions seen in sleep carried messages as urgent and precise as any envoy, shaping the fate of nations as subtly as the winds along the straits. Dreams, in the Ottoman mind, were sacred pathways between the mortal world and the divine. From infancy, Suleiman had been instructed to honor them, to record each vision with meticulous care, and to seek interpretation from learned scholars and mystics. A dream could forewarn of rebellion, signal the rise or fall of a minister, or even predict the outcome of military campaigns. The Sultan kept a collection of dream records, inscribed in fine ink upon polished parchment, each entry accompanied by notes from interpreters who claimed to understand the secret language of the subconscious and the divine. It was through this delicate and invisible guidance that he believed the empire could be preserved, expanded, and safeguarded. One night, as the moon cast silver upon the palace's domed roofs, Suleiman dreamt of a falcon circling a distant city. Its shadow stretched long across golden plains. In the dream, the bird's cry echoed like a warning, and its wings cast dark shapes over the walls of men's ambitions. He summoned his viziers, describing the dream with measured precision, and asked the chief interpreter for counsel. The dream, they said, signaled that an impending siege must be delayed, that the enemy's strength was greater than anticipated, and that the timing of engagement would decide victory or disaster. Acting on this vision, Suleiman postponed the campaign, adjusted troop placements, and reinforced supply lines. When the battle finally commenced, fortune favored the Sultan, and the army avoided what could have been catastrophic losses. Dreams influenced more than military decisions. Court intrigues, marriage alliances, tax reforms, and diplomatic missions were all filtered through their subtle counsel. Ministers and generals learned to listen carefully, to record every dream relayed by the Sultan, for even small symbols, a snake, a river, a sudden storm could determine policy. When the Sultan interpreted a recurring dream as a warning, envoys were redirected, enemies misjudged, and plots were uncovered before they could materialize. The invisible hand of superstition guided the empire, often more effectively than strategy alone, and whispered reminders that human planning must always bow to forces unseen. Even in private, Suleiman's nights were governed by vigilance. Lamps burned in chambers lined with ornate tiles, incense filled the air, and the Sultan would write down his dreams before dawn, recording each detail as if it were a sacred testament. Occasionally, he would summon a mystic to explain a vision, a bird's flight, or a fleeting shadow, believing that the divine spoke most clearly through the unconscious mind. These nocturnal consultations shaped the rhythm of the court, influencing decisions and tempering human ambition. With the caution of what could not be fully understood, the Sultan's reliance on dreams left a lasting mark on the Ottoman Empire. Historians note that many campaigns, treaties, and administrative reforms coincided with his visions, suggesting that superstition played a tangible role in shaping history. The empire, vast and disciplined, moved not only through the calculations of generals and ministers, but through the subtle authority of dreams interpreted as divine guidance. Every act, from the construction of mosques to the positioning of troops along distant borders, bore the imprint of visions glimpsed in sleep, even centuries later. In the quiet chambers of Topkapi, when the city is veiled in mist and the Bosphorus glimmers like molten silver, one can imagine Suleiman seated at his writing desk, recording the shapes of clouds, birds, and omens that visited him in dreams. Candlelight flickers on the polished wood, incense curls through the air, and the shadows of the past stretch across tiles decorated with flowers, stars, and sacred symbols. In this suspended space, between wakefulness and vision, superstition guided the mighty, reminding all that human power is never absolute, that even an empire's fate may hinge upon the subtle messages that arrive in sleep, unbidden but undeniable. Thus, the tale of the Ottoman Sultan who trusted dreams endures a testament to the invisible, subtle authority of superstition over rulers, policy, and history itself. It reminds us that empires, no matter how vast, are shaped as much by what is unseen as by what can be commanded. The visions of one man, recorded and revered, became a force that influenced the course of nations, bending history beneath the weight of symbols, omens, and the secret authority of the dream world. In the quiet valleys of feudal Japan, where mist clung to bamboo groves and mountains rose like dark guardians against the sky, the moon ruled the night with silver authority. Its pale light spilled across rice paddies, temples, and the walls of wooden castles, casting shadows that seemed alive with intent. Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate, ruled an empire of samurai, merchants, and peasants, yet even his disciplined mind trembled beneath the glow of the moon. It was said he feared its phases, its pull, and the strange, invisible forces it carried, omens capable of bending fate, inspiring rebellion, or summoning disaster upon an empire. The shogun's fear was cultivated over years of careful observation and superstition. Scholars and astrologers had taught that the moon's cycles influenced the hearts of men, the tides, and even the outcome of battles. A blood-red moon portended calamity, a crescent signaled opportunity, yet one misaligned or hidden behind clouds might mask deception, betrayal, or death. Tokugawa Iemitsu took these lessons to heart, weaving lunar observation into every aspect of governance. Ceremonies were timed to the moon's phases, military movements delayed or accelerated according to its waxing and waning, and diplomatic missions were planned under its watchful eye. The shogun trusted the invisible currents it carried more than the counsel of men. One autumn, as the harvest approached, an unusual lunar eclipse turned the moon a deep, ominous red. Advisors whispered unease, courtiers trembled at the sky's transformation. Iemitsu, observing from the highest tower of Edo Castle, summoned his astrologers and priests. They warned that the omens signaled treachery among distant lords and a potential uprising in a neighboring province. Immediately, the shogun issued secret orders, patrols increased, envoys were sent with coded messages, and key bridges and passes were fortified. When conflict arose weeks later, the rebellion had been contained with minimal bloodshed, interpreted by the court as proof that the shogun's reverence for the moon had saved the state from catastrophe. Even the private life of Iemitsu was guided by lunar superstition. He avoided certain gardens, rooms, and temples during dangerous phases, believing that the moon's light could carry ill fortune. Nightly walks, feasts, and religious rituals were scheduled with meticulous attention to lunar timing. Soldiers and retainers learned to anticipate which days would favor the shogun's presence in court or the field, and which nights required vigilance and restraint. The moon, though distant and silent, commanded obedience in every corner of the empire. In moments of quiet reflection, Iemitsu would gaze across Edo's rooftops at the pale disk hanging in the sky, seeing not only light, but portents. His fear of its hidden influence tempered pride, guided diplomacy, and shaped the rhythm of empire. Even those who doubted the supernatural power of the moon recognized its authority. To ignore its signals was to invite disaster, and the shogun's decisions, every alliance, every law, every campaign reflected an unyielding respect for forces beyond comprehension. The lunar influence extended to architecture and ritual. Temples were aligned with the moon's path. Gardens were constructed to reflect lunar reflections and ponds. Bridges were designed to frame its rise and set. The shogun's obsession with the moon left an imprint on the physical and political landscape of Japan, like the unseen currents of superstition that guided other rulers across time and continent. The moon's authority over the shogun shaped history, weaving fear, reverence, and ritual into the very governance of the realm. Even centuries later, when the night is clear and the moon spills silver across Tokyo's modern streets, one can imagine the shogun watching from the heights of Edo Castle. Shadows curl in the bamboo, rooftops gleam faintly, and the subtle pull of the moon seems to reach through history, reminding all who see of the delicate balance between human authority and unseen forces. The shogun's fear, carefully observed and meticulously acted upon, became a tool as effective as any army or law, guiding the decisions of an empire and tempering ambition with caution. Thus, the story of the Japanese shogun who feared the moon endures, a testament to the subtle, haunting power of superstition over rulers, politics, and destiny. It reminds us that human ambition, even at its most disciplined and calculated, bows to forces invisible and eternal. The pale light of the moon, silent and distant, shaped armies, alliances, and lives, illustrating that the fate of empires is often guided not by human intellect alone, but by the reverent fear of what cannot be fully understood. And so, beneath the silver glow, in the quiet rustle of bamboo leaves and the shimmer of moonlit rooftops, the shogun's vigilance persists in memory, a whisper across centuries, a subtle reminder that superstition, when entwined with power, can guide history as surely as any sword, law, or army. In the gilded halls of Versailles, where crystal chandeliers shimmered like captured starlight and mirrors multiplied the brilliance of candle flames, Queen Marie Antoinette moved with a graceful, deliberate caution. The laughter of courtiers, the rustle of silk gowns, and the measured steps of guards created a rhythm of perfection. Yet beneath the ornate veneer of the palace lay a silent tension, the queen's fear of numbers. Not wealth, nor politics, nor the plotting of ministers unnerved her most. It was the symbols themselves, digits and calculations, which she believed carried misfortune and subtle malice. From her earliest years in the Austrian court, Marie had been taught that certain numbers could portend death, betrayal, or ruin. 3 was considered ominous, 13 carried the weight of misfortune, and any total that seemed unbalanced was to be avoided at all costs. This fear extended into every facet of her life. Seating arrangements at banquets were calculated with meticulous care, tables were set to avoid unlucky totals, and invitations were distributed so that no number could bring ill fate. Even the choice of furniture and the arrangement of her chambers reflected a careful avoidance of numerical danger. During the height of her reign, when whispers of revolution and resentment stirred through Paris, Marie's superstition intensified. Ministers noticed that decisions, even those of state, were influenced by her belief in the portentous power of numbers. A treaty might be signed on a favorable date, a procession postponed to avoid a numerical omen, and correspondence delayed until the digits aligned in auspicious ways. Courtiers, familiar with her anxiety, often calculated her daily schedule around these invisible rules, ensuring that no misstep in arithmetic could invite disaster. One day, as she reviewed a list of debts, inventories, and accounts, the queen paused, her eyes tracing a particular total. The sum struck her as unlucky, and she summoned her closest advisors to adjust the figures, even if it required tedious repetition and ceremonial gestures. To Marie, the misalignment of numbers was not trivial, it was a potential harbinger of calamity. She believed that hidden forces attached to digits could influence human affairs, affecting the success of hunts, the outcome of negotiations, and even the favor of the king. The invisible authority of superstition, as inscribed in numerical form, guided not only her personal conduct, but the rhythms of Versailles itself. Her fear extended into public appearances. When choosing the date for a ball or a ride in the gardens, the numbers of days, the position of the sun, and the arrangement of courtiers were all considered. Any miscalculation could invite whispers of ill luck, or so she believed, and the queen's meticulous attention to these details became a form of ritual control, a way of asserting influence over an unpredictable world. Even in the private chambers of her apartments, she arranged mirrors, candles, at personal effects according to patterns that avoided dangerous totals. The queen's preoccupation with numbers was intertwined with her awareness of the fragility of power. Her fear was not mere eccentricity. It reflected a subtle understanding that human ambition, wealth, and authority are fragile when confronted with unseen forces. To act without regard for superstition, she believed, risked destabilizing both personal safety and the empire she inhabited. In this way, numbers became a lens through which the queen interpreted reality, blending ritual, superstition, and governance into a single, haunting system of control. Even centuries later, Versailles retains echoes of her meticulous vigilance. The arrangement of halls, gardens, and ceremonial spaces whispers of a time when superstition shaped not only personal choices, but also the rhythm of empire. The queen's fear of numbers reminds us that human authority is never absolute. Even the grandest palace, the most elaborate ball, and the most brilliant intellect can be guided by unseen, immutable forces. Superstition, delicate and invisible, can mold decisions, temper ambition, and influence history with a subtle hand as powerful as any army or law. Walking through the empty halls of Versailles today, when sunlight glints across polished floors and shadows stretch long over gilded walls, one can almost imagine Marie Antoinette, pen in hand, calculating sums, adjusting arrangements, and guarding herself against the invisible malice she believed lingered in numbers. The palace, vast and magnificent, is silent yet alive with her anxieties, a testament to the enduring power of superstition over rulers, decisions, and destiny. Thus, the story of the French queen who feared numbers endures a haunting reminder that human authority, no matter how opulent, bows to invisible forces, and that superstition, subtle yet absolute, can shape the course of lives, decisions, and even empires. In the quiet of Versailles, where light dances on mirrors and the shadows of history linger, the fear of numbers whispers across centuries, guiding the imagination and cautioning that even the grandest power is fragile beneath the weight of unseen omens. Above the marble and gold of Constantinople, where the domes of Hagia Sophia shimmered in the dawn, the stars wheeled silently across the night sky. Their cold, eternal light fell on the city's walls, reflecting in the waters of the Golden Horn and on the polished armor of the emperor's guards. Here, in the heart of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Constantine VII ruled with the authority of crown and church. Yet he placed greater trust in the heavens than in the men around him, the stars. He believed, carried the will of God, revealing dangers and fortunes invisible to mortal eyes, guiding choices that could determine the fate of empires. Constantine's obsession began early, nurtured by scholars, astrologers, and priests who claimed that celestial alignments shape human events. Charts were drawn, calculations recorded, and nights spent observing the heavens became as vital as councils of state. The emperor would summon astrologers to read the positions of planets, the angles of constellations, and the patterns of comets, interpreting them as divine counsel. Ministers and generals learned that even the most urgent matters, war, diplomacy, taxation, must wait until the stars spoke clearly, for a misreading of omens could invite disaster. From the collapse of a campaign to the betrayal of an ally, during a particularly turbulent spring, when threats loomed from the Bulgars to the north and internal unrest simmered within Constantinople, Constantine consulted the stars with intense scrutiny. Observers noted a rare alignment of Jupiter and Venus, a conjunction that astrologers interpreted as a warning of betrayal in the imperial court. The emperor delayed an expedition and summoned his most trusted officials to reconsider alliances. Suspicion fell upon several ministers whose ambitions had gone unchecked. When a conspiracy to seize power was later uncovered, the stars were credited with saving the empire, their silent guidance proving more reliable than the eyes of men. The emperor's reliance on celestial counsel extended to daily life. Ceremonies were timed with precise calculations of lunar and planetary movement. Decisions of law, taxation, and succession were influenced by astrological readings. Even the construction of bridges, aqueducts, and churches followed patterns aligned with the heavens. Those who served the emperor learned that obedience to earthly power was insufficient. One had to respect the invisible authority of the stars. Mistakes in interpretation could have consequences far beyond the individual, affecting the stability of Constantinople and the vast territories under Byzantine rule. In private chambers, Constantine would gaze through polished lenses at the stars, mapping the heavens with devotion and reverence. Candles burned beside manuscripts filled with calculations, and diagrams and incense curled into the air as if to carry prayers upward. Nights were spent in silent contemplation, noting every shift in planetary position, every subtle glimmer that might indicate the favor or disfavor of God. Even the simplest decisions, from the timing of a journey to the appointment of a provincial governor, were filtered through the lens of celestial will. Historians note that the emperor's decisions, guided by the stars, shaped alliances, battles, and policies in ways both subtle and profound. The empire, though disciplined and powerful, was never free from the invisible threads of superstition that guided its ruler. Courtiers, generals, and citizens alike understood that mortal authority, however absolute it seemed, bowed to forces beyond comprehension. The stars, eternal and silent, carried a judgment that no sword, council, or decree could override. Even centuries later, the sky above Istanbul holds a silent resonance of Constantine's vigilance. On clear nights, when the constellations gleam over the Golden Horn, it is easy to imagine the emperor watching, calculating, and listening to messages carried across light years, shaping history in ways invisible yet undeniable. His reliance on the heavens reminds us that human authority is fragile, and that superstition, when entwined with power, can guide decisions, protect empires, and temper the ambitions of rulers who forget that the universe itself is a sovereign. Walking through the ruins of Constantinople today, when sunlight glints on mosaic tiles and shadows stretch across ancient walls, one can almost sense the emperor's careful observation of the skies, the quiet calculations, and the reverence for forces invisible yet absolute. Superstition, here expressed in the authority of stars and planets, governed not only the mind of one ruler, but the fate of millions, shaping empires through silent, enduring influence. Thus, the tale of the Byzantine emperor, who trusted stars over men, endures a haunting reminder that even the most powerful leaders are bound by unseen forces, that human ambition is tempered by what lies beyond perception, and that superstition, silent and eternal, can shape history as decisively as armies, law, or diplomacy. The heavens, cold and distant, guided the empire in ways that no chronicler could fully explain, leaving a legacy of vigilance, reverence, and the subtle authority of the invisible. In the dense jungles of Rajasthan, where the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the distant roar of rivers, tigers prowled like shadows made flesh. Their stripes shimmered in the dappled sunlight, their eyes gleamed with silent intelligence, and their presence was both feared and revered. Within this realm of mystery and power, Maharaja Sawai High seemed to have Jaipur ruled, a man whose empire spanned forts, palaces, and vast stretches of arid land. Yet even his authority bowed to the guidance of these great cats, for the Maharaja believed that tigers, creatures both noble and dangerous, held insight into the unseen currents of fate. The Maharaja's fascination began as a child, wandering the forest with hunters and priests who whispered of the tiger's sacred power. They were more than beasts, they were omens, messengers of divine will, and guardians of the balance between life and empire. A tiger crossing one's path could foretell fortune or disaster. The way it drank from a river or rested in the sun carried meaning beyond mortal comprehension. Hastings internalized these teachings, consulting the movements and behaviors of tigers before making decisions that would affect kingdoms, armies, and the lives of his subjects. In the summer of 1727, the monsoon arrived late, threatening the crops, rivers, and livelihoods of the people. The Maharaja, aware that famine or unrest could destabilize his realm, turned to the forests and their regal inhabitants for guidance. Hunters were dispatched not merely to observe, but to interpret the tigers' behaviors, the direction of their travel, the ease with which they hunted, the signs of aggression or retreat. Priests and seers accompanied them, translating the silent language of the wild into counsel for the court. The tigers, it was believed, reflected the hidden currents of fortune, providing warnings invisible to men but crucial to survival. One particular tiger, large and old, was considered the most auspicious. Its movements were tracked meticulously over weeks, and the Maharaja's decisions where to allocate water resources, how to position troops along borders, and even the timing of festivals were influenced by its behavior. When the tiger approached a riverbank and drank in a certain pattern, the Maharaja interpreted this as a sign to redirect the flow of canals, to prevent flooding and ensure irrigation. Crops survived, trade continued, and the people attributed their prosperity to the Maharaja's reverent attention to the tigers. The influence of these majestic creatures extended into courtly life. Decisions about marriage alliances, appointments of ministers, and ceremonial events were guided by tiger omens. If a tiger appeared restless near the palace forests, certain celebrations were postponed. If it approached a particular path, military expeditions were delayed. The Maharaja's courtiers and generals learned to read the subtleties of these signs, recognizing that the invisible authority of superstition, embodied in a predator's silent grace, could outweigh even their own calculations. Even in the quiet of his chambers, Hyacinth meditated on the lessons of the forest. He would gaze across the palace terraces, listening to the distant roars and rustling of leaves, imagining the tigers moving through shadows, judging the empire with eyes that saw what humans could not. The Maharaja understood that power is fragile, that even kings are vulnerable to forces unseen, and that wisdom often arrives through channels that cannot be measured or explained. His respect for the tigers was not mere fear. It was recognition of the subtle authority of the natural and the divine, an acknowledgement that life, empire, and destiny are intertwined with what lies beyond perception. Even centuries later, the forests of Rajasthan echo with the presence of these animals. The forts and palaces of Jaipur stand as monuments not only to human ingenuity, but to a ruler's reverence for forces beyond the mortal eye. The story of the Maharaja who consulted tigers endures, reminding us that superstition can shape the course of empires, that the choices of rulers are tempered by fear and respect for the unseen, and that wisdom sometimes moves on silent paws, through shadowed forests, guiding, warning, and protecting those who learn to listen. Walking among the ancient trees, when the wind stirs the leaves and the sun casts long stripes across the jungle floor, one can almost sense Hyacinth observing, calculating, and heeding the silent counsel of tigers. His empire, vast and disciplined, bowed to an invisible authority, demonstrating that human ambition, no matter how grand, bends before forces that cannot be commanded, only respected. The tiger's eyes, green and unblinking, carried a subtle judgment, a reminder that the fate of kingdoms is often influenced by those who move unseen, that superstition can guide the strong as surely as armies, and that power, however absolute it appears, is never fully sovereign. Thus, the tale of the Indian Maharaja who consulted tigers endures a haunting testament to the invisible, subtle authority of superstition, to the wisdom of the wild, and to the delicate threads that connect fear, reverence, and destiny. In the quiet of the forests and the echoes of history, we are reminded that rulers, though mighty, are forever bound to the unseen, eternal forces that shape the world in ways both subtle and profound. In the icy corridors of the Winter Palace, where frost crept along windows and the wind howled through the Neva River, mirrors lined the walls like silent witnesses. Their polished surfaces reflected chandeliers, gilded frames, and the endless motion of courtiers. Yet they also captured the quiet dread of a man who ruled one of the largest empires the world had ever known. Tsar Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, walked these halls with eyes wary of his own reflection. He believed that mirrors were not merely glass, but gateways to misfortune, tools of envy, and vessels capable of capturing the soul itself. From early in his reign, Ivan learned to treat mirrors with suspicion. A glance in polished silver could betray hidden enemies, reveal conspiracies, or invite death. Courtiers whispered that even a careless reflection could draw the gaze of spirits, magnifying evil and sending it back upon the observer. The Tsar's fear was not mere superstition. It was a tangible force that influenced the rhythm of his court. Mirrors were covered with cloth, tilted away from windows, and placed only where the Tsar could control the angle of his own image. Servants moved cautiously, aware that a misaligned piece of glass could provoke rage or terror. Ivan's obsession with mirrors reached a chilling apex during the late years of his reign. He believed that treachery could manifest in reflections, that enemies might send cursed mirrors to spy on his private life or corrupt the empire. Every reflection was scrutinized, every polished surface tested for hidden power. In moments of extreme paranoia, the Tsar would smash mirrors that seemed to bear ill fortune, leaving jagged shards scattered across the floors of his private chambers. These acts of destruction, violent and deliberate, were both protective ritual and warning to all who served him. The unseen authority of superstition shaped the very architecture of power. Even the design of the palace was influenced by Ivan's fear. Mirrors were installed sparingly, in places where their effect could be controlled, and their angles meticulously calculated to avoid accidental glimpses. In ceremonial halls only, certain mirrors reflected the Tsar's image, and only at times approved by astrologers or priests. Courtiers adapted, learning to navigate a world where perception itself carried danger, where the simplest reflection can alter favor, provoke suspicion, or inspire terror. Life at court became a constant negotiation between authority, superstition, and fear, each mirror a silent arbiter of destiny. Thus his private life, too, was shaped by this dread. He would travel with covered mirrors, avoid rooms where light might strike polished surfaces, and inspect new artifacts with extreme caution. Sleep was taken in chambers free of reflective surfaces, and his advisors were instructed to remove or conceal any object capable of capturing a reflection. Even the daily movements of servants, soldiers, and family were coordinated around the careful avoidance of potential mirrors. In this way, superstition exercised invisible control, guiding the behavior of thousands and shaping decisions that affected the entire Russian Empire. Historians note that Ivan's fear of mirrors coincided with periods of extreme political paranoia, violent purges, and sudden shifts in policy. While the causes of his ruthlessness are complex, it is clear that superstition played a subtle yet pervasive role. The Tsar's belief in the hidden power of mirrors reinforced his vigilance, informed his judgments, and extended his authority beyond mortal oversight into realms governed by fear and unseen forces. Power, even absolute, was tempered by invisible influence, and the reflection of self became both guide and warning, even centuries later. The Winter Palace bears echoes of this fear. The halls still shimmer with crystal chandeliers, polished floors, and gilded frames, yet the memory of Ivan's dread lingers, a silent shadow over the surfaces that once terrified him. One can imagine the Tsar moving cautiously through corridors, eyes flicking at reflections, interpreting light and angle as omens, and commanding the empire with vigilance shaped by superstition. The fear of mirrors became a tool of governance, a way of mediating authority and controlling both perception and reality. Walking through the empty corridors today, when sunlight glints across glass and shadows stretch long on the floors, it is possible to sense the careful calculation, the dread, and the quiet tyranny of superstition that guided the Tsar. Ivan's life illustrates that rulers, however mighty, are never free from the influence of invisible forces. Mirrors, silent and reflective, shaped decisions, inspired caution, and held authority over the human mind, reminding us that superstition, subtle yet absolute, can wield power equal to any army or law. Thus, the story of the Russian Tsar who feared mirrors endures a haunting testament to the invisible authority of superstition over rulers, decisions, and empires. It reminds us that human ambition, no matter how vast, bends before the unseen, and that objects as simple as glass can carry the weight of fear, judgment, and influence. In the silent halls of the Winter Palace, the reflection of history shimmers, a quiet witness to the delicate threads that bind superstition, power, and destiny. Above the forbidden city, the sky stretched vast and unbroken, a tapestry of blue by day and velvet black by night. The walls of the emperor's palace shimmered, with gold, red lacquer, and jade, reflecting the authority of centuries of dynastic rule. Yet no display of wealth or power could ease the ancient fear that gripped the mind of the Chinese emperor during the rare and mysterious phenomenon of a solar eclipse. To him, the sudden swallowing of the sun was not merely a cosmic event, but a harbinger of chaos, a signal that heaven itself might be displeased with mortal affairs, and that the empire teetered on the knife edge of disaster. The emperor, seated upon his golden throne, surrounded by courtiers and ministers, would watch the sky with a vigilance born of reverence and dread. He relied upon astrologers, mathematicians, and soothsayers to predict eclipses with painstaking accuracy, for preparation was essential. These events were interpreted as messages from heaven, carrying the weight of judgment. An eclipse could forewarn rebellion, famine, or invasion. It could signal that the moral order of the empire had been disrupted. Every action taken during such omens, rituals, proclamations, even the positioning of soldiers was dictated by superstition, and the emperor's power itself was validated only by adherence to these celestial warnings. During the Ming Dynasty, a particularly long eclipse occurred over the capital. As shadows crept across the forbidden city, the emperor summoned court astronomers and ritual specialists. Drums thundered in the courtyards, gongs rang through the palace, and fires burned to frighten away the celestial dragon thought to be devouring the sun. Ministers knelt, trembling, as the emperor performed ceremonies to appease heaven. Offerings were made, proclamations issued, and even minor officials were compelled to participate in chants and processions designed to restore cosmic balance. The eclipse was both spectacle and warning, a reminder that the invisible authority of superstition dictated the rhythms of empire. The fear of eclipses influenced far more than rituals. Military campaigns were postponed, tax collection adjusted, and diplomatic negotiations delayed until astrologers confirmed that the sky had returned to favor. The emperor's personal behavior shifted. He would avoid public appearances, move only along auspicious paths, and consult the sages at every stage. Courtiers and generals learned that the success of their plans depended on the alignment of heavenly bodies as much as the merit of their actions. One misstep during the shadow of the eclipse could invite catastrophe, and superstition became a tool as potent as any edict or army. Even in private chambers, the emperor's mind remained fixed upon celestial patterns. Charts of stars and predicted eclipses lined the walls, inked with meticulous care. Each new observation was interpreted for meaning, and the court's daily rhythm bent around the anticipated wrath of heaven. The emperor understood that his authority was fragile, that the empire's stability rested not only on the loyalty of ministers and generals, but on maintaining harmony with forces beyond human comprehension. The eclipse was a moment when mortality, power, and superstition converged, and every heartbeat of the empire seemed to respond to the shadow crossing the sun. Historians note that Chinese emperors' fear of eclipses shaped not only court rituals, but the very governance of the empire. Decisions, alliances, and even territorial expansion were tempered by the invisible currents of superstition. The emperor's careful observance of celestial phenomena illustrates a profound truth. Human ambition, even at its most disciplined, bows before forces unseen. Eclipses, brief and fleeting, carried authority that rivaled the throne itself, guiding decisions, shaping policy, and reminding rulers that the cosmos watches silently, judging every act. Even centuries later, the Forbidden City bears the weight of these fears. Walking among its red walls, gilded roofs, and echoing courtyards, one can imagine an emperor peering through lattice windows, watching shadows glide across the sun, listening to drums and gongs, and sensing the fragile balance of fortune and disaster. The rituals, the calculations, and the collective dread of eclipse illustrate how superstition can govern empires, temper decisions, and shape history with invisible hands. Thus, the story of the Chinese emperor who feared eclipses endures a testament to the enduring power of superstition over rulers, policy, and destiny. It reminds us that authority, no matter how absolute, is tempered by forces beyond perception, that the course of history may bend beneath the weight of fear and ritual, and that even the most magnificent empire responds to signs written in shadow and light. In the quiet of the Forbidden City, when the sun glints on lacquered roofs and the winds stir ancient banners, the echo of the eclipse remains, a silent whisper of cosmic authority that once guided the fate of a civilization. High in the Andes, where mountains rise like jagged teeth into the sky and clouds cling to stone like restless spirits, the city of Cusco spread across terraces and temples, its walls carved from massive stones that had endured centuries of sun and rain. Yet no masonry, however precise, could ease the fear that gripped the Inca emperor, the Sapa Inca, whose authority stretched across valleys, rivers, and snow-capped peaks. For he understood that the very earth beneath his feet could rebel, shaking cities, toppling walls, and swallowing lives in a fury beyond human control. Earthquakes were not mere natural events, they were divine messages, warnings of imbalance, betrayal, or impending doom, and the emperor lived in constant vigilance before their silent, unpredictable force. From a young age, the Sapa Inca was taught that the earth itself was alive, a sentient entity whose anger could manifest through tremors and quakes. Priests and shamans guided him in rituals designed to appease Pachamama, the earth goddess whose favor ensured stability and abundance. Stone structures were built with precise interlocking techniques. Temples were aligned with mountains and rivers, and offerings of gold, food, and llama sacrifices were made to prevent the goddess's wrath. Yet even with these precautions, the Sapa Inca never walked without awareness of the trembling world beneath him, knowing that superstition and ritual were as essential as armies in preserving his rule. One morning, as mist curled around the peaks and the sun spilled golden light across terraces, a tremor rippled through Cusco. Though small, it sent shivers through the city and sent priests into urgent consultation. The Sapa Inca summoned his council of shamans, who interpreted the quake as a warning, a distant rebellion, hidden discontent among provincial leaders, and possible misfortune for a neighboring harvest. Acting on their counsel, he dispatched envoys, reinforced garrisons, and offered grand sacrifices to Pachamama to restore harmony. Weeks later, unrest was detected in the exact region predicted. A famine was avoided through careful redistribution of resources. The earthquake had spoken. Its superstition had guided the empire. The emperor's fear influenced every aspect of governance, the placement of buildings, the timing of festivals, and even the routes of processions through the city were dictated by omens. Read from the earth itself. A tremor could delay a campaign, postpone a royal marriage, or alter the collection of tribute. Soldiers and officials learned that the Sapa Inca's decisions were entwined with unseen authority. One misalignment, one failure to heed ritual or sign could bring calamity not only upon the ruler, but upon the people themselves. Even in private, the Sapa Inca maintained vigilance. He walked among terraces and temples, listening to subtle vibrations, observing the behavior of animals that predicted tremors, and consulting shamans who interpreted subtle shifts in rock and soil. Nights were spent in meditation and prayer, offerings placed near sacred stones, and chants carried into the cold mountain air to appease Pachamama. The emperor understood that power is fragile, that even the most disciplined army could not contend with the unpredictable wrath of the earth, and that superstition, carefully observed, was a tool as vital as any weapon. Historians note that Inca infrastructure, from terrace fields to aqueducts, was deeply influenced by the Sapa Inca's fear of earthquakes. The empire's architectural brilliance, its precise masonry, and the ritual practices designed to prevent calamity were inseparable from superstition. The earth's authority, silent yet absolute, guided decisions, tempered human ambition. It shaped history in ways that modern observers can barely measure. The Sapa Inca's reverence for unseen forces illustrates that even the mightiest rulers are subject to elements beyond comprehension, that superstition can govern policy, and that fear, when entwined with sacred belief, becomes a force that preserves life and empire alike. Even centuries later, the terraces and temples of Cusco endure, the stones locked together as if to resist the trembling earth, a testament to the wisdom born of fear. Standing among them, when winds whip through high passes and clouds obscure jagged peaks, it is possible to imagine the emperor moving through the city, attuned to the subtle vibrations beneath his feet, offering prayers and sacrifices, and governing with both human authority and divine guidance. Superstition, in the form of fear of earthquakes, shaped an empire, directing resources, lives, and decisions with a subtle hand that rivaled armies or decrees. Thus, the story of the Inca emperor who feared earthquakes endures a haunting reminder that human ambition and bends before invisible forces, that superstition can guide rulers with precision and power, and that the fragility of empires is often measured not in armies, but in reverence for forces beyond comprehension. In the quiet of the Andes, among stone terraces and sacred temples, the trembling earth whispers across centuries, carrying the memory of a ruler who listened, obeyed, and governed under the authority of what could not be seen, predicted, or commanded. In the candlelit halls of Surmi's palace, shadows danced upon oak paneling, flickering like spirits summoned by the firelight. Outside, the chill of the English night crept along cobblestone streets, while the muffled footsteps of servants echoed in long corridors. King James I, who ruled an empire both proud and uneasy, moved cautiously through these halls, for he bore a fear as old as superstition itself, the black cat. To him, these sleek, dark creatures were not merely animals, but omens of misfortune, messengers of betrayal, and instruments of unseen malice, capable of twisting fate in ways both subtle and terrifying. James's fear was nurtured in childhood, steeped in tales whispered by nurses, clergy, and wandering storytellers. Black cats were linked to witches, to sorcery, and to the secret powers that could unsettle kingdoms. He believed that a black cat crossing one's path was a warning of imminent disaster, that its hiss could echo the plotting of enemies, and that its shadow could draw misfortune into even the safest chambers. This dread shaped his reign, influencing not only personal behavior, but the administration of justice, the rhythm of court life, and the perception of danger within the empire. During one particularly tense winter, when conspiracies and rivalries simmered in both parliament and the court, the king's fears seemed confirmed. A black cat appeared at the palace gates, its eyes gleaming like obsidian in the torchlight. Courtiers froze in apprehension as James reportedly recoiled, his mind tracing patterns of impending calamity. The royal astrologers and advisors interpreted the event as a warning of plots against the throne. Ministers were scrutinized, envoys delayed, and ceremonial rituals performed to ward off the malice that seemed to accompany the feline visitor. Though the cat vanished as mysteriously as it arrived, its presence influenced decisions for days, guiding the king's attention toward threats real and imagined. James's superstition extended beyond mere observation. He refused to walk in certain gardens after dusk, fearing a black cat might slip silently through shadows. He delayed audiences when the animals were seen near palace windows, and he instructed that corridors and staircases be patrolled to prevent the crossing of these dark omens. In this way, superstition exerted invisible authority over the king's actions, affecting the decisions of ministers, generals, and even the arrangement of public ceremonies. Every movement, every plan, had to consider the possibility that a creature's presence carried meaning beyond the material world. Even in private chambers, James remained vigilant. He would inspect corners and alcoves, listen to the subtle sounds of paws or the flick of a tail, and consult with advisors when unexplained phenomena occurred. The black cat became a symbol not merely of personal fear, but of the fragility of authority, reminding the king that the unseen could influence events as surely as armies, taxes, or decrees. Superstition, in this form, was both a guide and a constraint, shaping choices and tempering ambition with caution born of dread. Historians note that James's fear of black cats intersected with his broader preoccupations with witchcraft, astrology, and hidden threats. The presence of superstition in governance was not merely eccentric. It altered the timing of decisions, the treatment of suspected traitors, and even the conduct of diplomatic missions. The invisible influence of fear shaped the palace's routines, the court's hierarchy, and the perception of danger, demonstrating that the authority of superstition could rival any tangible power within the empire. Even centuries later, surmised whispers of this dread linger. Walking through empty corridors, when candlelight flickers across carved panels and shadows stretch long upon polished floors, one can imagine the king pausing, listening, and calculating, aware of every movement in the darkness. The black cat, silent and unseen, governed not only the imagination of a man, but the rhythm of empire, guiding, warning, and shaping history with subtlety and precision. Thus, the story of the English king who feared black cats endures a haunting testament to the invisible authority of superstition, to the power of fear in guiding rulers, and to the fragile boundary between human ambition and unseen influence. In the shadowed halls of history, the presence of a small, dark creature reminds us that the course of empires is often swayed not by armies or laws alone, but by the vigilance, reverence, and subtle dread of those who govern, and by the quiet omens that silently shape destiny. Across the endless steppes of Mongolia, where grass rippled like water under the wind and the horizon stretched unbroken, the sky was a kingdom in itself. It could be serene, painted in the soft gold of dawn, or it could erupt in fury as clouds darkened, thunder roared, and lightning split the heavens in jagged white. To the Mongol Khan, Genghis' successors believed that lightning was more than a natural phenomenon. It was the voice of Tengri, the eternal sky god, delivering warning, judgment, and sometimes vengeance. And for the great Khan, who ruled these vast lands, lightning was a force so sacred and terrifying that even the mightiest warriors deferred to its invisible authority. The fear of lightning was cultivated early in the life of the Khan. Shamans, steeped in centuries of oral tradition, taught that a bolt striking the earth could signal betrayal, death, or divine disfavor. Campfires were tended carefully, tents were positioned to avoid high ridges, and rituals were performed to honor the sky god whenever clouds gathered. Lightning was unpredictable, yet in its unpredictability lay profound meaning. A strike could alter the course of battle, decide the favor of allies, or punish arrogance. The Khan's vigilance was constant, his eye ever toward the sky, and his respect for these forces tempered even his legendary ferocity. During the reign of a particularly restless successor, a violent storm swept across the steppes in the early summer. Thunder rolled over yurts and ridges, and jagged streaks of lightning tore the clouds asunder. The Khan, riding among his generals, halted the movement of troops and called for a council of shamans. Each flash and rumble was interpreted a bolt. To the east warned of rebellion among distant clans. A streak to the west predicted famine along key grazing lands. Decisions that would have once been made swiftly raids, troop deployments, and diplomatic missions were delayed or altered to appease Tengri and honor the invisible force that could decide victory or ruin. The Khan's fear influenced not only military strategy, but daily life. even in the safety of his tent. Arrangements of furniture, ceremonial objects, and the positioning of guards were dictated by the direction and presence of storms. Horses were stabled with attention to the threat of lightning, and scouts were dispatched to observe cloud patterns and the behavior of animals. That sense approaching danger, courtiers and soldiers learned to move with caution, understanding that the sky's judgment carried authority equal to that of the Khan himself. A miscalculation or neglect of omen could bring disaster to camp and empire alike. In private, the Khan would sit alone, wrapped in furs, listening to the pulse of the storm. The smell of ozone and the sharp crackle of electricity filled the air, and he reflected on the precariousness of power. Even the greatest warriors and most loyal generals could not contend with forces that sprang from the heavens. Lightning was absolute, impartial, and uncontrollable, and in its presence, human ambition seemed fragile, fleeting, and insignificant. The Khan's fear was not weakness, it was recognition that survival and dominance in the steppe required reverence for invisible forces, a partnership with powers that no sword or strategy could compel. Historians note that Mongol strategy, particularly the avoidance of key areas during storms, the timing of raids, and the careful attention to natural signs, was deeply intertwined with this fear of lightning. It influenced supply lines, troop movements, and even alliances, demonstrating that superstition was a tool of governance as potent as any weapon. The Khan's vigilance and ritualized respect for the sky forged a delicate balance between human authority and divine influence, ensuring that even in the vast, untamed steppes, power moved in harmony with unseen forces. Even centuries later, the Mongolian plains carry echoes of these storms. When clouds gather on the horizon and the wind sweeps across grasses like waves, it is possible to imagine the Khan scanning the sky, feeling the electricity in the air, and guiding his empire according to forces both visible and invisible. Lightning, fleeting yet absolute, shaped decisions, tempered ambition, and safeguarded an empire in ways that human planning alone could never achieve. The fear of the sky became a means of control, a system of respect that bound men to ritual, observation, and the unpredictable authority of nature. Thus, the story of the Mongol Khan, who feared lightning, endures a haunting reminder that rulers, no matter how mighty, bend before invisible and uncontrollable forces. Superstition, deeply woven into observation, ritual, and reverence, guided choices, preserved life, and shaped the destiny of an empire. On the steppes, where the horizon stretches endless and storms flash with sudden brilliance, the legacy of fear and respect for the unseen remains, whispering across time, reminding all who listen that power is never absolute and that the sky itself can govern the fate of men. Along the fertile banks of the Nile, where papyrus reeds swayed and the river's waters gleamed like liquid gold beneath the Egyptian sun, the life of the land depended on rhythm, flood, and fertility. Crops, cattle, and cities rose and fell with the river's mercy. And among the rulers of this ancient civilization, one Pharaoh Amenhotep III, though some whisper of earlier kings held a fear that ran as deep as the river itself, the silence of the Nile, for the Pharaoh, a river that ceased its bounty, that whispered no sound, or that failed to flood as promised, was not merely a natural anomaly, it was a sign that the gods were displeased, that the order of man had faltered, and that empire teetered on the edge of ruin. The Pharaoh's attentiveness to the river began in childhood, nurtured by priests who interpreted the waters as divine speech. When the Nile rose and fell with expected rhythm, it was blessing. When it faltered, tremors of dread rippled through palaces and temples. Every day, the Pharaoh would walk along terraces overlooking the river, observing its flow, noting subtle changes in color, temperature, and movement. Scribes recorded patterns, and priests performed rituals to coax the waters, offer prayers, and ensure that the Nile's voice continued to sustain the kingdom. Superstition intertwined with governance, for a silent river was a silent warning, and the Pharaoh understood that listening to the river was as vital as commanding armies. During a particularly harsh summer, the Nile's waters receded beyond expected bounds. Farmers and fishermen murmured in fear as the banks cracked and parched. The Pharaoh summoned priests to interpret the anomaly, and elaborate rituals were performed. Sacrifices of livestock, processions of priests carrying sacred icons, and chants echoing across the river's edge. The entire city of Thebes moved in quiet, ceremonial vigilance, for the silence of the Nile was interpreted as displeasure from Amun-Ra and Hapi, the deities who controlled fertility, flood, and life itself. Even minor disruptions in daily life, from the timing of tax collection to the schedule of royal audiences, were adjusted according to the river's response. The pharaoh's fear extended to private contemplation. Within chambers adorned with hieroglyphs and frescoes depicting the god's favor, he would meditate on the river's patterns, feeling its pulse in the rising waters and imagining the consequences of drought. Dreams were interpreted as omens. Birds along the river were observed for signs, and minor tremors in the earth beneath temple foundations were studied as potential warnings. The river's silence, absolute and terrifying, was an authority unto itself, guiding not only ceremonial acts but practical governance, the allocation of granaries, the dispatch of laborers for irrigation, and the timing of naval expeditions along the Nile were all influenced by this fear. Historians note that the pharaoh's obsession with the river shaped agriculture, religious practice, and political stability. Temples were constructed with sacred alignment to the Nile's flow. Ritual canals directed water to fields and offerings, ensured the river's favor. Superstition became governance. And fear of silence was as potent as fear of rebellion or invasion. The invisible authority of the gods manifested in the flow of water, tempered decisions, guided actions, and demanded a constant, reverent attention from ruler and subjects alike. Even centuries later, the Nile carries whispers of these fears. When the river flows calm under the sun, reflecting the eternal sky and the towering palms, it is possible to imagine a pharaoh standing on a terrace, listening to its voice, interpreting its movements and acting to appease invisible forces. The river's rhythm shaped civilization, guided rulers, and dictated the delicate balance between life and famine. Its silence, rare yet profound, was a force that no mortal hand could command, a subtle authority that shaped the rise and fall of kingdoms along its banks. Thus, the story of the Egyptian pharaoh who feared the Nile's silence endures a haunting reminder that rulers, no matter how powerful, are beholden to forces beyond comprehension. Superstition, reverence, and fear intertwine to shape decisions, preserve life, and maintain cosmic order. In the quiet flow of the Nile, among reeds and papyrus, the echoes of an ancient ruler's vigilance remain, whispering across millennia that power is fragile, and that the unseen currents of nature and divinity carry a judgment as absolute as any army or law. Above the misted mountains and bamboo forests of feudal Japan, the night sky stretched like a dark silk banner, scattered with countless stars that glimmered faintly in the cold air. Among the dainty lights, a streak of fire sudden, sharp and fleeting would sometimes appear, a comet blazing across the heavens. To ordinary peasants, it was a curiosity, a fleeting spectacle. To the shogun, the supreme military ruler of Japan, it was a harbinger of calamity, a celestial messenger that demanded attention, ritual, and caution. The appearance of a comet could foretell rebellion, famine, or the death of a great lord, and the shogun's fear of these fiery omens shaped the governance of his domain with invisible, unyielding authority. From a young age, the shogun was taught by court astrologers and Buddhist monks that celestial events were tied to human fortune. Comets were considered dangerous, the movement of fire across the heavens interpreted as divine warning. Their appearance required meticulous observation. The shape of the tail, the brightness, the speed, all were recorded, analyzed, and weighed against the events of the realm. A comet could delay a military campaign, postpone the succession of a vassal, or influence the timing of harvests. It was more than superstition. It was an ancient, respected system of guidance that intertwined the heavens and the temporal world. During the mid-16th century, a brilliant comet appeared in the sky over Kyoto, burning with eerie brilliance for weeks. Courtiers whispered of ominous signs, and the shogun convened his council, summoning astrologers to interpret the fiery messenger. The comet's tail, long and sharply curved, was seen as a warning of insurrection in distant provinces. Orders were sent to reinforce garrisons, inspect loyalty among vassals, and secure strategic castles. The movement of armies was dictated not only by strategy, but by the interpretation of the celestial fire, and even minor officials learned that disobedience or neglect could invite disaster. Both earthly and divine, the shogun's fear extended into personal life as well. He avoided public appearances during the comet's peak visibility, altered ceremonial rituals, and instructed monks to perform chants and prayers to appease the heavens. Letters were delayed, festivals postponed, and sacred objects displayed in alignment with cosmic favor. Comets became regulators of time and action, shaping decisions that might otherwise have been guided by calculation or intuition alone. Every flash of celestial fire was treated with reverence, its influence infiltrating even the smallest choices of governance, even in private chambers. The shogun observed charts and predictions, contemplating the significance of the comet's movement. Candles flickered over ink diagrams, incense curled like spirits in the air, and advisors whispered interpretations that could mean the difference between stability and chaos. The fear of the comet was a silent authority, tempering ambition and instilling vigilance. It reminded the shogun that human power, even absolute within palace walls, is fragile in the face of cosmic judgment. Historians note that the appearance of comets often coincided with shifts in Japanese politics. Rebellions, famine, or natural disasters were linked retrospectively to these celestial phenomena. The shogun's reliance on superstition reinforced his control, guiding decisions, preserving order, and shaping perception. The invisible authority of fear, intertwined with reverence for the heavens, molded the empire's rhythm as surely as any army or law. Even centuries later, when one gazes up at the night sky over Kyoto or Edo, imagining the silhouette of a shogun's palace against the moonlit hills, it is easy to picture the ruler watching, calculating, and responding to fiery streaks across the heavens. The comet's light, fleeting yet profound, governed not only human imagination but the destiny of kingdoms, silently shaping the course of history. Its brilliance, both beautiful and terrifying, serves as a reminder that rulers are never free from unseen forces, that superstition can dictate decisions as much as strategy, and that fear of the unknown is as ancient as power itself. Thus, the story of the Japanese shogun who feared comets endures a haunting reflection on the invisible authority of superstition, the delicate balance between ambition and cosmic influence, and the subtle ways in which fear of the heavens shaped an empire. In the quiet of bamboo forests and temple courtyards, when stars glimmer and shadows stretch long, the echo of vigilance remains, a whisper of a ruler's careful observation, reverent fear, an acknowledgement that even the mightiest hand is guided by forces far beyond mortal comprehension. In the glittering halls of the Palace of Versailles, where gilded walls shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, and polished marble reflected the brilliance of 100 candles, a quiet dread haunted the queen. Marie Antoinette, young and resplendent, moved gracefully among courtiers and nobles. Yet she carried with her an almost sacred fear, the broken mirror. To her, a fracture in glass was not mere accident, it was a harbinger of misfortune, a warning, a betrayal, and a vessel capable of fracturing not only reflections but destiny itself. Each pane of glass, each polished surface, held the power to influence events, and superstition governed her steps as surely as etiquette or protocol. From childhood, the queen had been taught that mirrors were delicate repositories of fate. An accident, a crack, a shattered reflection could invite disaster, illness, or loss. In the glittering court of Versailles, where politics was subtle and envy ran like a hidden river, broken mirrors became symbols of unseen threats. Courtiers whispered, and servants moved cautiously, knowing that a single misaligned pane might summon dread. Every mirror in Marie's apartments was inspected, every reflection considered, and every accident treated as a matter of both ritual and consequence. One afternoon, as autumn sunlight fell through tall windows, a servant dropped a hand mirror, shattering it into countless shards. The queen froze, her eyes tracing the fractured lines, imagining the calamity they might herald. Priests and astrologers were consulted, omens were interpreted. The broken mirror seemed to ripple through the court like a silent proclamation. Minor quarrels intensified, letters from distant allies were scrutinized for hidden meaning, and the queen's advisors moved with caution, aware that superstition now dictated the rhythm of the palace. Even events of little consequence, delayed correspondence, misaligned dinners, or a misplaced jewel were interpreted through the prism of fear. Marie's obsession with mirrors extended beyond the court into private moments. She would walk slowly through her chambers, observing the alignment of glass and silver, ensuring that no reflection might carry ill omen. When a mirror was broken, it was repaired, replaced, or richly cleansed, and minor ceremonies were performed to restore the balance between reflection and fortune. Courtiers understood that superstition could dictate behavior more firmly than command, that the queen's fear of broken mirrors shaped the cadence of their lives as thoroughly as royal edicts. The queen's concern reflected a deeper understanding of power's fragility. She understood that the court, alive with jealousy and ambition, could be influenced as easily by omens as by intrigue. Mirrors, delicate and reflective, became instruments of authority, their fractures signaling caution, restraint, and vigilance. Even her personal decisions, alliances, audiences, and daily movements were tempered by the subtle tyranny of superstition, a reminder that power, though absolute in appearance, was always vulnerable to unseen forces. Historians note that Marie Antoinette's fear of mirrors, intertwined with broader anxieties about courtly intrigue, illustrates the pervasive role of superstition in shaping behavior. Objects seemingly ordinary could wield influence, guiding actions, tempering ambition, and creating a subtle, invisible framework of authority within the court. The Queen's careful attention to reflective surfaces was both practical and symbolic, a fragile object reflecting both light and omen, capable of shaping lives and histories alike. Even centuries later, the echoes of her fear linger in the corridors of Versailles. When sunlight strikes a pane of glass or the shadow of a chandelier falls across polished floors, one can imagine the Queen moving quietly, observing reflections, performing subtle rituals, and governing her world with the cautious reverence of one who knows that fortune may be fractured by a mere accident. The broken mirror, small yet potent, reminds us that superstition can guide the decisions of rulers, influence the course of history, and assert authority invisible to all but those attuned to its silent power. Thus, the story of the French queen, who feared broken mirrors, endures a haunting testament to the subtle and invisible authority of superstition, to the delicate interplay between fear, ritual, and governance. In the gilded halls, among reflections and shadow, we are reminded that even the most magnificent reigns are guided by invisible threads, that fragile objects can carry profound meaning, and that the unseen, like a fractured mirror, has the power to shape the destiny of empires. Above the domes and minarets of Constantinople, the sky stretched wide and unbroken, a vast canvas of shifting clouds and piercing light. To the citizens, it was a world of trade, prayer, and ordinary life. To the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, however, the heavens held a language of warning, and none spoke more profoundly than the sudden disappearance of the sun. Eclipses were not merely celestial curiosities, they were omens, messages from Allah, harbingers of upheaval, betrayal, and the fragile turn of fortune. The Sultan, whose power was absolute in the streets and courts below, trembled before this unseen authority, aware that even emperors are subject to the judgment of the sky. From early in his reign, the Sultan was educated by scholars, astrologers, and court astrologers to observe the heavens with vigilance. Eclipses were anticipated with careful calculation, and rituals were performed to mitigate their portent. During an eclipse, the palace would fall into solemn quiet, with drums muted and fountains stilled. Guards and courtiers moved with a studied reverence, understanding that the Sultan's fear was not merely private, but a force that could shape decisions, postpone battles, or redirect the flow of governance. The heavens, in their sudden darkness, wielded authority greater than armies or law. In the winter of 1582, a dramatic eclipse darkened Constantinople for hours, turning day into a cold, trembling twilight. The Sultan withdrew from audiences, summoning astrologers and religious advisors to interpret the phenomenon. They whispered of rebellion in distant provinces, treachery within the palace, and the need for ritual to restore divine favor. Sacrifices were performed in mosques, coins were distributed to appease the people, and prayers filled the city as the shadow passed slowly across the sun. Even minor events, from courtly audiences to military orders, were delayed until the astronomers confirmed that favor had returned. The eclipse, fleeting yet profound, commanded obedience from the Sultan and all who served him. The Sultan's fear influenced policy, alliances, and military strategy. Campaigns were postponed if an eclipse loomed, emissaries delayed their journeys, and the careful alignment of ceremonial events depended upon celestial approval. Within the palace, scholars charted stars, priests performed rituals, and courtiers moved with awareness that the shadow of the sun could determine their fates. The Sultan's attentiveness to these signs demonstrated a recognition of power's fragility. Even the most absolute ruler is bound by forces beyond comprehension, and superstition, carefully observed, can govern the empire as surely as any army. Even in private, the Sultan meditated on the rhythms of the heavens. Candles flickered in tall lanterns, incense curled like smoke against the painted walls, and maps of celestial phenomena adorned his study. He reflected on the transience of fortune, the inevitability of fate, and the fragile authority of human power. The eclipse was both warning and guide, reminding him that the unseen, cosmic, divine, and inscrutable shaped history as much as policy, diplomacy, or conquest. Historians note that Ottoman governance, rituals, and courtly behavior were profoundly influenced by celestial superstition. Eclipses were occasions not only of fear, but of precise, calculated response. They could redirect the empire's attention, guide decisions, and temper the ambitions of those who wielded power. Superstition, in this sense, was as vital as any institution, shaping the rhythm of life, the order of the court, and the fate of countless subjects. Even centuries later, when the sky over Istanbul darkens for fleeting moments, one can imagine the Sultan standing on the balcony of the Topkapi Palace, eyes lifted toward the sun, sensing the shadow, interpreting the celestial warning. The city falls quiet in his mind's eye, drums stilled, fountains paused, and courtiers watching silently, awaiting the return of light. The eclipse, though brief, holds the power to guide decisions, shape empires, and remind rulers that even the greatest authority is subordinate to forces unseen. Thus, the story of the Ottoman Sultan who feared eclipses endures a haunting testament to the invisible authority of superstition, the delicate interplay of fear and governance, and the profound influence of the cosmos on human history. In the quiet of minarets along the waters of the Bosphorus, the shadow of the sun whispers across time, a subtle reminder that rulers are never free from unseen judgment, and that the heavens, silent and distant, shape the destinies of men and empires alike. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, where canals shimmered like liquid obsidian and temples rose toward the sky, in stepped pyramids of stone, the Aztec emperor gazed at the heavens with a mixture of reverence and dread. The sun, a blazing orb of life and power, was the axis upon which the empire turned, yet it could vanish without warning, swallowed by darkness in the silent terror of a solar eclipse. To the emperor, this was no mere spectacle of nature, it was a harbinger, a sign that the gods were displeased, that the delicate balance of the universe teetered on the edge, and that the fate of the empire itself was in jeopardy. From early childhood, the emperor was instructed by priests and astrologers in the sacred rhythms of the heavens. The movements of the sun and moon were not only celestial mechanics, but divine language. An eclipse was interpreted as a warning. The sun, angered or weakened, demanded offerings of blood, devotion, and sacrifice. The emperor's fear was not idle. It was a guiding principle that dictated war, diplomacy, and the distribution of resources. Each shadow crossing the sky was studied with precision, and every response was orchestrated to restore harmony between gods, people, and cosmos. During one terrifying eclipse, the sun was swallowed for hours, turning the day into a ghostly twilight. In the temple courts, priests and nobles gathered, performing chants and rituals to awaken the sun, offering precious obsidian knives, blood from captured warriors, and elaborate ceremonies meant to appease Huitzilopochtli, the sun god. The emperor presided over these rites with solemn attention, understanding that the god's favor could not be commanded through fear or force alone. The city's inhabitants, sensing the seriousness of the moment, joined in ritual observances, their voices and footsteps marking a rhythm of reverence that echoed through the stone plazas. The emperor's fear extended beyond ceremonies. Military campaigns were paused, construction projects delayed, and tributes reassessed. Ambassadors and tributary rulers were cautioned against movement, for the sun's disappearance was a warning that the natural and political order could be disrupted. Within the palace, advisors monitored the length of darkness, the positioning of celestial bodies, and the behavior of birds, snakes, and other creatures whose movements were believed to indicate divine displeasure. Superstition guided every choice, for the emperor knew that the god's silence was more powerful than any decree, army, or sword. Even in private, the emperor reflected on the fragility of power. From the highest terraces, he observed the shadow that crept across the sun, feeling the pulse of the city and the pulse of the universe alike. Candles flickered in chambers adorned with gold and jade, incense coiled like smoke against stone. Walls and ritual drums throbbed softly, echoing the heartbeat of the empire. The eclipse reminded him that human authority is fragile, that even the mightiest ruler is subordinate to cosmic will, and that superstition, carefully observed, was essential to survival. Historians note that the fear of solar eclipses profoundly shaped Aztec governance, ritual practice, and daily life. Temples were aligned to the sun's course, sacrifices were timed according to celestial events, and strategic decisions, whether in war, agriculture, or diplomacy, were influenced by omens. The emperor's vigilance demonstrates that superstition was not mere superstition, but an invisible architecture of power, guiding the empire, shaping behavior, and preserving balance between mortal ambition and divine will. Even centuries later, when the sun is briefly shadowed across the Americas, one can imagine the emperor atop the Templo Mayor, eyes lifted, observing the darkness with solemnity, directing offerings and listening to the chants of priests. The eclipse, fleeting yet terrifying, governed decisions, tempered ambition, and shaped history in ways that no sword or decree could replicate. Its silence, absolute and commanding, reminds us that unseen forces, ancient fears, and reverence for the cosmos can wield power equal to that of armies, kings, or empires. Thus, the story of the Aztec emperor who feared solar eclipses endures a haunting testament to the author. Eerie of superstition, the weight of cosmic judgment, and the fragile interplay between human ambition and divine will. In the quiet of stone plazas and atop towering pyramids, the shadow of the sun whispers across time, a subtle reminder that rulers, no matter how mighty, govern not only through strategy and power, but through vigilance, ritual, and reverent fear of forces that lie beyond mortal comprehension.